Good evening, and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. Tonight we're travelling to a place where rivers created kingdoms, where kings became gods, where ordinary people built structures so precise and so permanent that 21st century engineers still cannot fully explain how they did it. Ancient Egypt is not just a civilization, it is a statement, a declaration, written in stone and gold and painted plaster, that humanity was capable of something extraordinary. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The gift of the Nile, before Egypt, was Egypt, before there were pyramids, before there were pharaohs, before there were priests chanting in candlelit temples along the river's edge. There was simply the land itself. And the land, before Egypt made it famous, was a place of extraordinary contrast. On one side, life. On the other, death. Not separated by mountains or oceans, but by a matter of meters. Step one direction, and you stood in green, fertile, humming abundance. Step the other, and you stood in one of the most merciless deserts on the surface of the earth. This contrast, this almost theatrical division between nourishment and annihilation, was not accidental. It was the defining fact of everything that followed. The Nile River is the longest river in the world. It stretches over 6,600 kilometers from its sources in the highlands of equatorial Africa, all the way north to the Mediterranean Sea. It passes through 10 modern countries. It drains a basin covering roughly 10% of the African continent. And yet, for the purposes of our story tonight, what matters most about the Nile is not its length or its drainage area or its hydrological complexity. What matters is what it did every single year, with a regularity so perfect that ancient Egyptians considered it nothing less than divine. Every year, between June and September, the Nile flooded. The rains that fell on the Ethiopian highlands sent enormous volumes of water rushing northward into the desert, overflowing the river's banks, spreading across the floodplain, and depositing a thick layer of dark, rich silt across the valley floor. This silt, carried from the volcanic highlands of East Africa, was among the most fertile soil on the planet. When the floodwaters receded, they left behind a renewed earth, moist and dark and ready for planting. The Egyptians called this black earth Kemet. They called the desert Deshret, the Red Land. And from these two words, two colours, two worlds separated by a few footsteps, an entire civilization was born. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, called Egypt the gift of the Nile. He was right, and he was right in ways even he probably did not fully appreciate. Without the Nile flood, there would be no Egypt. The desert extends right up to the river's edge in many places. Left to itself, the valley would be a dry and uninhabitable stretch of rock and sand, no different from the vast emptiness that surrounds it. But the flood came, year after year, with a dependability that no other river on earth could match. It was not simply a natural phenomenon. To the people who depended on it, it was a promise, a covenant made by heaven with the earth. And here is something worth pausing on, because it distinguishes Egypt from almost every other ancient civilization we know of. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates flooded as well, but they flooded unpredictably, violently, sometimes destroying entire villages without warning. The floods of Mesopotamia bred anxiety. They bred flood myths, stories of divine punishment, narratives of chaos unleashed. The Nile flood, by contrast, was gentle and reliable. It rose slowly, spread quietly, and receded on a schedule so consistent that the Egyptians built their entire agricultural calendar around it. 3 seasons structured Egyptian life. Akhet, the inundation, when the flood came and farming was impossible. Pere, the growing season, when crops were planted in the black earth the flood had left behind. And Shemu, the harvest season, when the grain was cut and stored before the heat grew too intense. This rhythm, this annual heartbeat of rise and fall, nourishment and rest, gave Egypt something that most ancient societies lacked: predictability, surplus, security. While other civilizations struggled to feed themselves year to year, Egypt consistently produced more grain than it needed. Granaries filled, populations grew, labour became available for projects beyond mere survival. The pyramid is, in a very real sense, the product of a reliable flood. Without the Nile's generosity, there would have been no surplus. Without surplus, there would have been no labour to spare. Without labour to spare, those limestone blocks would never have left the quarry. The geography of Egypt reinforced this abundance with protection. The eastern and western deserts formed natural barriers that made invasion difficult. The cataracts, rocky stretches of river in the south, blocked easy navigation from Nubia. The marshy, fragmented coastline of the Nile Delta in the north made amphibious assault complicated. Egypt was, by accident of geography, a fortress. Its walls were not stone but sand, not mortar but distance. For much of its early history, it was simply easier to leave Egypt alone than to attack it. This isolation allowed the civilization to develop in relative peace, building its institutions and its character over centuries without constant disruption from outside. The Nile also gave Egypt something almost as valuable as food and protection. It gave it a road. The river ran from south to north, true, but the prevailing winds in Egypt blow from north to south. This meant that boats could travel downstream by letting the current carry them, and travel upstream by raising a sail. The Nile was, in effect, a two-lane highway running the length of the country, carrying people, goods, stone, grain, timber, soldiers, and ideas from one end of Egypt to the other, with a ease that would have been the envy of any ancient civilization. Communication was possible, administration was possible, unity was possible. In a country that stretched over 1,000 kilometers, this was not a trivial gift. The land itself was narrow. The cultivated strip on either side of the Nile was rarely more than a few kilometers wide. In some places it was barely a kilometer. Beyond that strip, nothing. This narrowness meant that Egypt was, demographically speaking, a long thin line of people pressed together along a river, rather than a broad settled territory the way that China or Mesopotamia were. Everyone in Egypt lived near the Nile because nobody could live far from it. This produced a shared experience, a common dependence on the same source of life, that helped foster the sense of unified identity that would eventually give rise to a unified state. And the Nile did one more thing for Egypt that deserves mention before we move on. It connected it to the rest of Africa. The river was not only a road within Egypt, but a link to the world beyond its southern border, to Nubia, to the Sudan, to the lakes and highlands of equatorial Africa. Through this connection, Egypt received gold from the mines of Nubia, ebony and incense from the forests further south, cattle and people and ideas from the vast continent of which it was, despite its Mediterranean face, always a part. Egypt liked to think of itself as the centre of the world, and in many ways it was, but it was also always part of a wider African world that nourished it, challenged it, and in the end, outlasted it. So before we meet a single pharaoh, before we see a single hieroglyph, before the first stone is laid on the first pyramid, take a moment to appreciate the landscape. The blue river cutting through red rock, the narrow strip of green stretching from horizon to horizon, the absolute total silence of the desert pressing in from both sides, the sky so clear and so blue at noon, so impossibly crowded with stars at night, that it must have seemed to the people living beneath it not merely a backdrop but a presence, an active, watchful, meaningful presence. The sky mattered in Egypt, the river mattered, the seasons mattered, everything connected to everything else in a web of meaning that the Egyptians would spend 3,000 years trying to describe, decorate, and understand. Tonight, we are going to follow that attempt all the way to its end. The first Egyptians, pre-dynastic life and the birth of civilization. Long before the first pharaoh united the two lands, long before the first pyramid rose above the desert plateau, human beings were living along the Nile. They had been there for a very long time. Archaeological evidence shows that early hominins inhabited the Nile Valley and the surrounding regions for hundreds of thousands of years. Stone tools found in the deserts of Egypt tell the story of people who lived through periods when the Sahara was green and wet, when lakes dotted the landscape, when animals that we now associate with sub-Saharan Africa roamed across what is now barren sand. Egypt before Egypt was a different world entirely, wetter, greener, and far more hospitable to human life. Around 10,000 years before the Common Era, as the Ice Age ended and the world warmed, the Sahara began to dry. The lakes shrank, the grasslands retreated, the animals followed the water southward and eastward, and the people who had lived on those grassy plains did what people do when their environment changes. They adapted. Many followed the animals south, but others moved toward the one permanent source of water that remained, the Nile Valley. The drying of the Sahara was, in a sense, the beginning of Egypt. Pressure from the desert pushed people toward the river. The river sustained them, and over the following millennia those people built something that the world had not seen before. The earliest settled communities along the Nile emerged around 5,500 before the Common Era. Archaeologists have given names to these cultures based on the sites where they were first discovered, In Upper Egypt, meaning the southern part of the country where the Nile flows northward from a higher elevation, the Badarian culture appeared around 4,400 before the Common Era. The Badarians were farmers. They grew wheat and barley. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats. They made pottery decorated with geometric designs, and they buried their dead with care, placing food and objects in graves that suggest a belief in some form of afterlife. Even at this very early stage, that concern for what happens after death was present. It would never leave. After the Badarians came the Naqada culture, which archaeologists have divided into 3 phases stretching from roughly 4,000 to 3,100 before the Common Era. This is where things start getting genuinely interesting, and where you can actually see, in the archaeological record, civilization assembling itself piece by piece before your eyes. The Naqada period was a time of growth, experimentation, and increasing complexity. Villages grew larger. Some villages grew into towns. Craftsmanship became more refined. Trade networks expanded, connecting the Nile Valley to the Levant, to Nubia, and to the Egyptian deserts where gold, minerals, and stone could be found. Naqada pottery is among the most beautiful prehistoric ceramics ever produced. Painted with ships, animals, people, and abstract designs, these vessels were not merely functional objects. They were expressions of a worldview, attempts to capture the world in image and symbol. The boats painted on Naqada pottery are particularly significant. Some scholars believe they represent ritual journeys, perhaps connected to beliefs about death and the afterlife, beliefs about the journey of the soul across water to another world. If so, then the idea of the boat as a vehicle for the dead, an idea that would become central to Egyptian religion, and that you can see in its fully developed form in the boat buried beside the Great Pyramid of Giza, was already present in these early riverside communities thousands of years before the pyramids were built. Society during the Naqada period was becoming stratified. That is a polite archaeological way of saying that some people had more stuff than others, and that this difference was increasingly permanent and inherited. Elite burials from the late Naqada period contain objects that clearly indicate high status. Imported lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carved ivory combs, copper tools and weapons, vessels made from hard stones like porphyry and basalt that required enormous skill and effort to produce. These were not the possessions of ordinary farmers. These were the belongings of a ruling class, people who had accumulated power and wealth, and who were, for the first time, beginning to look like the prototype of what Egyptian society would eventually produce, the pharaoh. The late Naqada period also sees the first evidence of writing in Egypt, or at least the first evidence of a symbolic system that was moving in the direction of writing. Marks on pottery, on ivory labels, on stone. Some of these marks appear to be early hieroglyphs, predecessors of the writing system that would become one of the most distinctive features of Egyptian civilization. The relationship between early Egyptian writing and the cuneiform writing that appeared slightly earlier in Mesopotamia is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. Did Egypt develop writing independently? Did it borrow the idea from Mesopotamia while developing its own symbols? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. What we do know is that by the time the first dynasties appeared, writing was already present in Egypt, and it was already being used for the purposes that would define it for the next 3,000 years, recording names, quantities, and the deeds of powerful people. Trade during this period was not merely an economic activity, it was a cultural force. Objects from the Levant appear in Egyptian graves. Egyptian objects turn up in excavations in modern Israel and Palestine. Mesopotamian artistic motifs, the so-called foreign style, appear briefly in late Naqada art before being replaced by distinctly Egyptian imagery. Egypt was not isolated. It was in contact with the wider ancient world, absorbing influences and adapting them, taking what was useful and making it its own. This capacity for cultural absorption while maintaining a distinct identity would characterize Egypt for its entire history. Daily life in pre-dynastic Egypt was organized around the river and the agricultural cycle. Farming occupied the growing season. The inundation season, when the fields were flooded, was a time for other kinds of work, for building, for fishing, for craft production. Villages were small, typically a few hundred people at most. Houses were built of mud brick, a technology perfectly suited to the environment. Mud brick is cool in summer, warm in winter, easily repaired, and endlessly available along a river that deposits silt by the ton. Mud brick is also, unfortunately, not very durable over archaeological time, which is one reason we know more about pre-dynastic Egyptian burials than about pre-dynastic Egyptian houses. The dead were more carefully preserved than the living. Religion in this early period was local and diverse. Each community had its own protective deity, often an animal, a falcon, a jackal, a cobra, a crocodile. These local gods would eventually be integrated into the vast and complex theological system of dynastic Egypt. But at this stage they were simply the spiritual guardians of particular places and communities. The world was alive with sacred presence. The river was divine. The sun was divine. The flood was divine. Death and rebirth were woven into the landscape itself in the annual cycle of inundation and harvest, and the religion that emerged from this landscape reflected its rhythms with extraordinary fidelity. By around 3200 before the Common Era, the Nile Valley was home to a recognizable proto-civilization. Agriculture was well established. Towns were growing. Craft specialization was producing objects of considerable sophistication. A ruling elite was emerging. Writing was beginning. Trade was flourishing. All the ingredients were present. What was still missing was unity. The Nile Valley was divided into a collection of chiefdoms and small kingdoms, each with its own ruler, its own gods, its own territory. The process by which these fragments were eventually hammered, cajoled, and conquered into a single unified state is the story of the next chapter. It is a story of kings with scorpion names, of battles on the Nile, of a world in the process of becoming Egypt. The Scorpion Kings, unification and the dawn of dynasty. Around 3100 before the Common Era, something extraordinary happened. The scattered chiefdoms and kingdoms of the Nile Valley were unified into a single state, stretching from the First Cataract in the south to the Mediterranean coast in the north, a distance of roughly 1,000 kilometers. This unification is one of the foundational events of ancient history. It created the longest-lasting state in the ancient world, and it was achieved, as far as we can tell, through a combination of trade, diplomacy, religious authority, and outright conquest. The details are murky, the evidence is fragmentary, but the broad shape of the story has become clearer as archaeologists have dug deeper into Egypt's earlier centuries. By the late Naqada period, the region we know as Upper Egypt, that is, the southern portion of the country, had already gone through a process of political consolidation. Several powerful centers had emerged, and over time, one of them had come to dominate the others. This dominant center was the city of Hierakonpolis, known to the ancient Egyptians as Nekhen. Hierakonpolis was, at its height around 3300 before the Common Era, probably the largest settlement in Egypt. It had a population of perhaps 10,000 people. It had specialized craft production, large brewing facilities, and evidence of a ruling elite that was already expressing its power in distinctly royal ways. Hierakonpolis is where some of the most important early evidence of Egyptian kingship has been found. Among the objects recovered from Hierakonpolis is one of the most famous artifacts in all of Egyptology, the Narmer palette. This carved stone object, discovered in 1898, depicts on one side a large figure wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking a smaller figure with a mace while another figure kneels at his feet. On the other side, the same large figure wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, the crown of the north, and inspects rows of decapitated enemies. The figure is identified by a hieroglyphic name as Narmer, and the palette, it is generally believed, commemorates the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler. Now, I should mention here that Egyptologists enjoy a good argument as much as anyone, and the question of exactly who unified Egypt and exactly when is one that has generated decades of scholarly debate. Was it Narmer? Was it an earlier king, sometimes called Scorpion I or Scorpion II, whose names appear on other early artifacts? Were there multiple phases of unification, with different rulers completing different parts of the process? The truth is probably that unification was a process rather than a single event, that it took place over several generations, and that multiple rulers contributed to it. But Narmer is the name most commonly associated with the final achievement of unity, and the palette that bears his name remains one of the most powerful images of political authority ever created in the ancient world. The significance of the two crowns cannot be overstated. Upper Egypt, the south, was symbolized by the white crown, a tall conical helmet that looks remarkably like a bowling pin. Lower Egypt, the north, the Delta region, was symbolized by the red crown, a flat-backed helmet with a curling wire in front. The pharaoh who ruled both lands wore both crowns, either separately or combined into what is called the double crown, the shent, This wearing of two crowns was not mere ceremony. It was a political statement made visible. It said, "This person rules both halves of the world. This person has achieved what the gods intended, the union of the two lands." Every pharaoh for the next 3,000 years would make the same claim. The imagery established by Nama and his contemporaries proved extraordinarily durable. The man or men who created unified Egypt established something else that would prove equally durable, a concept of kingship that was not merely political but cosmic. The pharaoh was not simply a ruler. He was the incarnation of Horus, the falcon god, son of the sun, mediator between the human and divine worlds. He was the force that held chaos at bay, the living representative of the divine order that the Egyptians called Ma'at. Ma'at is a concept that deserves some time because it is central to everything that follows, translated variously as truth, justice, harmony, or cosmic order. Ma'at was the principle that governed the universe. It was the right relationship between all things, the proper functioning of the sun, the Nile flood, the seasons, the social order, the behavior of individuals. Everything that worked as it should was Ma'at. Everything that was wrong, chaotic, unjust, or disordered was its opposite, Isfet. The pharaoh's primary duty was to maintain Ma'at. This meant conducting the rituals that kept the gods happy, which in turn kept the sun rising, the Nile flooding, and the crops growing. It meant leading armies to defend Egypt's borders, because invasion was a form of chaos. It meant administering justice, because injustice disrupted the proper order. It meant building temples, because temples were the houses of the gods and the gods needed houses to inhabit. Everything the pharaoh did was, in theory, an act of cosmic maintenance. He was not a dictator managing a population. He was, or presented himself as, the axis around which the universe turned. Lose the pharaoh, and you lose Ma'at. Lose Ma'at, and you lose everything. The administrative center of the new unified state was established at Memphis, near the apex of the Nile Delta. Memphis was a brilliant choice. Situated at the point where Upper and Lower Egypt met, it was both geographically central and symbolically appropriate. It was a place where the two lands literally came together, where the narrow valley of the south opened into the broad delta of the north. The city would remain one of Egypt's most important centers for the rest of its ancient history. Around Memphis, and on the desert plateau nearby, the earliest royal tombs were built. The cemetery at Abydos in Upper Egypt contains the tombs of the earliest kings, including what may be the tomb of Nama himself. Later royal cemeteries at Saqqara near Memphis contain the tombs of 1st and 2nd dynasty officials and eventually kings. These early tombs were not pyramids. They were rectangular structures of mud brick called mastabas, a word from the Arabic for bench, because they somewhat resemble the low benches found outside Egyptian houses. Inside these mastabas, the dead were buried with everything they might need in the afterlife: food, drink, furniture, tools, weapons, jewelry. Sometimes, in the very earliest period, servants were buried alive alongside their masters to continue serving them after death. This practice disappeared fairly quickly, replaced by model servants and later by the magical spells and images that filled later tombs. The first two dynasties of Egyptian history, what Egyptologists call the early dynastic period, lasted from roughly 3100 to 2686 before the Common Era. This period is when the institutions of Egyptian civilization were being established. Writing developed rapidly during these centuries, moving from a limited set of symbols on labels and pottery to a sophisticated system capable of recording complex administrative information. The bureaucracy grew. The system of nomes, administrative districts, was organized. The religious calendar was established. Temples were built. The visual style of Egyptian art, with its distinctive combination of frontal and profile views in the human figure, was standardized. All of this happened in the early dynastic period, relatively quickly in historical terms, as the new unified state figured out how to run itself. By the time the Third Dynasty began around 2686 before the Common Era, Egypt was ready for something genuinely monumental. And monumental is exactly what it got. The Old Kingdom, pyramids, pharaohs, and the Age of Stone. The Old Kingdom is the period that most people picture when they think of ancient Egypt. It is the age of the pyramids, the age of the Sphinx, the age when pharaohs were as close to gods as any rulers in human history have ever claimed to be. It stretched from roughly 2686 to 2181 before the Common Era, spanning the 3rd through the 6th dynasties. It was an era of extraordinary ambition, extraordinary achievement, and in the end, extraordinary collapse. The Old Kingdom begins, in a sense, with a single man and a single building. The man was Imhotep, chief minister and architect to the pharaoh Djoser of the Third Dynasty. The building was the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, completed around 2650 before the Common Era, and the Step Pyramid changed everything. Before the Step Pyramid, royal tombs were mastabas, flat-topped rectangular structures of mud brick. Imhotep took this basic form and did something that no one had done before. He stacked mastabas on top of each other, each slightly smaller than the one below, creating a stepped structure of 6 tiers that rose 62 meters above the desert. It was the tallest man-made structure in the world at the time of its construction. It was built not of mud brick but of stone, cut limestone blocks. This was another innovation. Before the Step Pyramid, stone had been used only for small objects and architectural details. Imhotep was the first person to use it as the primary building material for a large structure. He essentially invented large-scale stone architecture. The effect must have been extraordinary. Imagine standing in the desert, the flat horizons stretching in every direction, the sky enormous and blue overhead, and then this thing rising above the plateau, stepped, white, impossible. You would not have had a word for it because nothing like it had ever existed before. The ancient Egyptians, who were not generally given to excessive hyperbole about their own achievements, were clearly astonished by it. Imhotep's fame outlasted his own lifetime by thousands of years. By the late period, more than 2,000 years after his death, he had been deified. He became a god of healing and wisdom, the only Egyptian commoner ever to achieve full divine status. That is how impressive building the first large stone structure in history was considered to be. Not bad for a Tuesday. Djoser's Step Pyramid was not built in isolation. It was the centerpiece of a vast funerary complex surrounded by a wall of white limestone nearly 10.5 meters high and encompassing an area of 15 hectares. Within the walls were courts for the performance of royal rituals, shrines, and subsidiary structures. The whole complex was designed to be the eternal home of the king's spirit, a setting in which the rituals necessary for his continued existence in the afterlife could be performed forever. This concept, the royal funerary complex as a complete sacred world, would be elaborated and refined by every subsequent pharaoh of the Old Kingdom. After Djoser, the development of the royal tomb moved quickly. The pharaohs of the Fourth Dynasty, Sneferu, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure, took the stepped form and refined it into the true pyramid with smooth, angled sides, by a process that we can actually trace in the archaeological record. Sneferu, the founder of the Fourth Dynasty, built 3 pyramids. 3. The man was either extraordinarily ambitious, extraordinarily experimental, or extraordinarily bad at getting things right the first time, probably all 3. His first pyramid at Meidum began as a step pyramid and was then converted, not entirely successfully, into a true pyramid. The outer casing eventually collapsed, leaving the stepped core standing today like a strange geometric tower in the middle of the desert. His second pyramid, the bent pyramid at Dashur, started with a steep angle that the builders apparently decided partway through was too steep, so they changed the angle midway up, giving the finished structure its distinctive kinked profile. His third pyramid, the Red Pyramid, also at Dashur, finally achieved the true pyramid form with clean, smooth sides at a consistent angle. Sneferu's 3 pyramids, taken together, contain more stone than any other pyramid complex in Egypt, including Giza. He was a man who really, really liked pyramids. The Fourth Dynasty was the apex of Old Kingdom power. The state was centralized, the bureaucracy was efficient, the agricultural surplus was enormous, and the pharaoh's authority was absolute or nearly so. Officials served at the king's pleasure, and held their positions by royal appointment rather than by hereditary right, at least in theory. The great noble families had not yet accumulated the independent power bases that would later threaten royal authority. The pharaoh stood at the center of everything, and everything was organized around his needs, both in this life and the next. The administration of the Old Kingdom was managed by a small group of royal relatives and trusted officials. The most important of these was the vizier, who served as the pharaoh's chief minister and managed the day-to-day affairs of the state. Below the vizier were officials responsible for agriculture, taxation, construction, the military, and the religious institutions. This bureaucracy left records that have survived, and from those records we can reconstruct something of how the Old Kingdom actually worked. Grain was measured and taxed. Labour was organised through a system of corvée service, in which farmers were required to give a portion of their time each year to state projects. This labour, organised, fed and housed by the state, built the pyramids. Daily life for ordinary Egyptians during the Old Kingdom was shaped by the agricultural cycle and by the demands of the state. Farmers grew wheat and barley in the black earth left by the flood. They raised cattle and poultry. They fished the Nile and hunted the birds that nested in the papyrus marshes along its banks. Houses were small and simple, mud brick with few rooms, their flat roofs serving as additional living and sleeping space in the hot months. Villages were close-knit communities where extended families lived and worked together. Religion was part of daily life, not separate from it. Small household shrines held images of protective deities. Amulets were worn against disease and bad fortune. The gods were present in the home as surely as they were in the great temples. Craftsmen occupied a special position in Old Kingdom society. Sculptors, painters, carpenters, metalworkers, jewelers. These were skilled professionals who worked in state workshops attached to the royal palace and the great temples. Their products were not created for a market but were produced on commission for the king, the nobles, and the religious institutions. Some of these craftsmen achieved considerable status and left records of their own. The tombs of Old Kingdom officials decorated with scenes of daily life, agriculture, hunting, craft production, and feasting give us an extraordinarily vivid picture of what life looked like for the upper levels of Egyptian society. These paintings and carvings, still bright and clear after 4,000 years, are among the greatest artistic achievements of the ancient world. Women in Old Kingdom Egypt held a legal status that was remarkable for the ancient world. They could own property, enter into contracts, bring lawsuits, and manage estates. Elite women are depicted in tomb art alongside their husbands, often of equal size, a visual statement of comparable status. Queens could hold considerable political power, and the title of Queen Mother conferred both prestige and influence. This does not mean that Old Kingdom society was egalitarian by modern standards. It was deeply hierarchical, and women were generally expected to operate within a domestic sphere. But compared to the status of women in contemporary Mesopotamia, or in classical Greece and Rome, Egyptian women of the Old Kingdom had a surprising degree of legal and social agency. As the Old Kingdom progressed through the 5th and 6th dynasties, changes were accumulating beneath the surface of apparent stability. The power of the pharaoh was being gradually distributed outward. Provincial governors, the nomarchs who administered the regional districts, were becoming more independent. Hereditary offices were replacing royal appointments. The great estates of the temples and the nobles were accumulating land and wealth that was no longer directly under royal control. The sun god Ra, whose cult was centered at Heliopolis, was increasing his hold on royal theology. The 5th dynasty pharaohs built sun temples as well as pyramids, dividing resources between two types of divine architecture. These changes were slow and not immediately obvious. The 6th dynasty, Pharaoh Pepi II, reigned for an extraordinary 90 years, the longest reign in all of Egyptian history. But those 90 years saw the continued erosion of central authority and the growth of provincial power. By the end of his reign, the Old Kingdom was exhausted. The state that had built the pyramids, organized corvée labor on an industrial scale, and maintained the cosmic order for 5 centuries, was running out of the energy it needed to sustain itself. The collapse, when it came, was not sudden, but it was dramatic. Building the impossible, the Great Pyramid and its secrets. At this point in our story, we need to stop and spend some serious time with the Great Pyramid of Giza, because no other structure in human history has generated more fascination, more speculation, more outright nonsense, and more genuine archaeological mystery than this single building. And it deserves proper attention. The Great Pyramid was built by the pharaoh Khufu, son of Sneferu, during the 4th dynasty, approximately 2560 before the Common Era. It stands 138 meters tall today, slightly reduced from its original height of 146 meters due to the loss of its outer casing and capstone over the centuries. Its base covers more than 53,000 square meters. It's made of approximately 2,300,000 stone blocks, each weighing on average 2.5 metric tons. Some blocks in the internal chambers weigh as much as 80 tons. For 4,000 years it was the tallest man-made structure on Earth. The Lincoln Cathedral in England, completed in 1130, finally surpassed it. So the Great Pyramid held the height record for, let me check my notes here, roughly 3,800 years, which puts every other human architectural achievement in perspective. The building of the Great Pyramid required a workforce of roughly 20,000 to 30,000 workers at any given time, according to current archaeological estimates. I say current because this number has been revised significantly over the decades. For a long time, the popular image of pyramid building featured hundreds of thousands of slaves being whipped by cruel overseers. This image is wrong on almost every level. We know this because we found the workers' village. In the 1990s, archaeologist Mark Lehner and his team excavated the settlement near Giza, where the pyramid builders actually lived. What they found was not a slave camp. It was an organized town with bakeries that produced thousands of loaves of bread per day, breweries producing beer, a hospital with evidence of surgical procedures, administrative buildings, and workers' cemeteries. The men and women buried in those cemeteries were not slaves. They were working-class Egyptians who had been recruited, fed, housed, and medically cared for by the state. Their skeletons show evidence of hard physical labor, healed fractures, arthritis, and joint damage from years of heavy work. But they were not malnourished. They were not beaten. They were workers, doing what Egyptian citizens were required to do as part of the corvée system, contributing their labor to the great project that maintained Ma'at. The logistics of building the Great Pyramid are staggering. 2,300,000 blocks needed to be quarried, transported, shaped, and placed at an average rate of about 1 block every 2 minutes over the 20-year construction period. The limestone for the bulk of the pyramid came from a quarry on the Giza Plateau itself, immediately adjacent to the building site. This was efficient. You did not have to move those blocks very far. The fine white limestone used for the exterior casing came from quarries at Tura, across the Nile, and had to be floated to Giza on boats during the flood season when the river was high. The granite used for the internal chambers came from Aswan, 900 kilometers to the south, and was transported on river barges, a journey of weeks. How were the blocks placed? This is the question that generates the most speculation, some of it sensible and some of it frankly silly. The ancient Egyptians did not have cranes, pulleys, or powered machinery of any kind. They had human muscle, wood, rope, copper tools, and ingenuity. The most widely accepted explanation today is that the blocks were moved on sledges, pulled over smooth tracks that were wetted to reduce friction. Experiments have shown that a surprisingly small number of people can pull a large block on a well-lubricated sledge. For raising blocks to height, the favoured explanation is a combination of internal and external ramps, though the exact design of these ramps is still debated. Some scholars favour a single long external ramp, others favour a spiral ramp around the pyramid's exterior, others favour multiple shorter ramps. None of these explanations is perfect, and the honest answer is that we are not entirely sure. What we are sure about is the precision. The Great Pyramid's base is level to within 2 centimeters across its entire extent. The sides are oriented to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of less than 1 degree. The internal chambers are aligned and constructed with a precision that modern builders with power tools and laser levels would be proud of. This was not accident. This was the result of extremely sophisticated surveying, planning, and execution. The Egyptians who built the pyramids were not primitive people struggling with a task beyond their capabilities. They were skilled professionals with centuries of accumulated expertise in stone cutting, surveying, logistics, and construction. Inside the Great Pyramid are 3 chambers connected by passages. The subterranean chamber, cut into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, was apparently abandoned during construction. The Queen's Chamber, despite its name, was probably not intended for a queen, and may have been a secondary burial plan. The King's Chamber, in the heart of the pyramid, is the chamber that was actually used for the pharaoh's burial. It is lined entirely with red granite from Aswan, highly polished, and contains a large granite sarcophagus. When the Arab explorer Al-Mamun tunnelled into the pyramid in 820 before the Common Era, the first person to enter the King's Chamber in recorded history, he found the sarcophagus empty. Whether it was ever occupied, and what happened to the body of Khufu if it was, remains unknown. The Great Pyramid also has 2 sets of small shafts that run from the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber upward at angles toward the pyramid's exterior. These shafts were long thought to be ventilation channels. More recently, some scholars have argued that they were aligned with specific stars and served a religious rather than a practical purpose, perhaps providing a channel through which the pharaoh's spirit could ascend to the stars after death. The shafts in the Queen's Chamber end before they reach the exterior and appear to be blocked by doors, one of which was partly opened by a robot camera in 2002, revealing only another small chamber and another door. What lies behind that second door remains unknown. At some point I suspect someone will open it, and it will either be empty or extremely anticlimactic because that is generally how these things go. The Great Pyramid was the centerpiece of a larger complex that included a smaller pyramid for Khufu's chief queen, 3 even smaller pyramids for other queens, a mortuary temple on the pyramid's eastern face where daily offerings were made to the king's spirit, a long causeway connecting the mortuary temple to a valley temple at the edge of the floodplain, and boat pits containing the dismantled timbers of full-size wooden boats. 2 of these boat pits have been excavated. The first, discovered in 1954, contained the planks of a 43-metre cedar boat in perfect condition, now reassembled and displayed in a museum beside the pyramid. The second pit was investigated in the 1990s and found to contain a second boat in more fragile condition, which is still being carefully conserved. Just south of Khufu's pyramid stands the pyramid of his son Khafre, slightly smaller but built on higher ground so that it appears taller. It is Khafre's pyramid that retains most of its original white limestone casing at the top, giving you a sense of how these pyramids must have gleamed in the desert sun when they were newly built. They were not the weathered yellow-grey of today. They were blinding white. They could be seen for enormous distances across the flat desert landscape. They were meant to be seen. They were declarations, in stone, of the pharaoh's power and the god's approval. At the foot of Khafre's causeway crouches the Sphinx, the great limestone figure with the body of a lion and the head of a human, almost certainly a portrait of Khafre himself. The Sphinx is carved from a knoll of limestone that was left standing when the stone around it was quarried for the pyramid, then shaped into the famous figure. It is the largest ancient monumental sculpture in the world. Like the pyramids, it generates enormous amounts of speculation about secret chambers, hidden passages, and mysterious purposes. The answer probably is somewhat simpler. The Sphinx was a guardian figure, placed at the entrance to the royal necropolis to protect it, which is an extremely pharaonic thing to do when you want to protect something. You carve a lion with your face. The third pyramid at Giza belongs to Khafre's son Menkaure. It is significantly smaller than the other 2, and this reduction in scale marks a turning point. The age of truly colossal pyramid building was ending. After Menkaure, no Egyptian pharaoh would build anything on the scale of the Giza pyramids. Whether this reflects declining royal power, changing religious priorities, resource constraints, or simply a recognition that 3 enormous pyramids were probably enough, is not entirely clear. Probably all of those things. But the Giza Plateau would remain the most recognizable complex of buildings in human history, for 4,500 years and counting. The First Intermediate Period, when Egypt fell apart. After the long reign of Pepi II ended around 2184 before the Common Era, Egypt fell apart. The period that followed, stretching roughly from 2181 to 2055 before the Common Era, is called the First Intermediate Period, and it is, compared to the pyramid-building glory of the Old Kingdom, a somewhat uncomfortable chapter in Egypt's story. The carefully maintained unity, the cosmic order, the divine pharaoh holding chaos at bay, all of this dissolved, and what replaced it was fragmentation, civil war, famine, and uncertainty. The causes of the collapse were multiple, and they had been building for decades. The provincial governors, the nomarchs, had been accumulating power and independence throughout the late Old Kingdom. Royal appointments had been replaced by hereditary offices. The great estates of the nobles and the temples had grown wealthy enough to operate independently of the central government. The resources that had once flowed exclusively to the pharaoh and his building projects were being diverted into local power structures that had their own interests, their own ambitions, and their own soldiers. Then there was climate. Archaeological and geological evidence suggests that the decades around 2200 before the Common Era saw a significant reduction in the Nile flood. This was not a local phenomenon. It appears to have been part of a broader climate event, a prolonged dry period that affected the entire eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. In Egypt, reduced Nile floods meant reduced harvests. Reduced harvests meant hunger. Hunger meant instability. The elaborate system of state granaries and redistribution that had kept Egypt fed through bad years required a strong central government to manage. When that central government weakened, the system broke down. Some regions hoarded grain, others went hungry. Local strongmen filled the vacuum left by royal authority, promising to feed their communities in exchange for loyalty. Contemporary texts from the First Intermediate Period describe conditions that are, to put it mildly, difficult. One text, known as the Admonitions of Vipua, describes a world turned upside down. The poor have become rich, the rich have become poor, Men who once possessed fields now have nothing. Children are dashed against walls. The land is in tumult. This text has sometimes been used as evidence for specific historical events, including a possible connection to the biblical plagues of Egypt, which has generated enormous scholarly controversy and very little consensus. But taken simply as a literary reflection of the period, the admonitions give us a sense of how deeply the collapse of Old Kingdom order shook those who lived through it. For people who believed that the pharaoh's power was what kept the sun rising and the Nile flooding, the failure of both royal authority and natural abundance must have felt genuinely cosmically alarming. Egypt during the first intermediate period was divided. In the north, a line of rulers centered at Heracleopolis maintained a claim to be the legitimate successors of the Old Kingdom. In the south, the provincial rulers of Thebes, a city in Upper Egypt that had been relatively minor during the Old Kingdom, were growing increasingly powerful. For a generation or more, the country existed in a state of de facto partition, with the Heracleopolitan kings controlling the north and the Theban rulers controlling the south. This was not a stable situation. Both sides wanted all of Egypt. The arts and literature of the first intermediate period are sometimes dismissed as provincial and crude compared to the classical refinement of Old Kingdom work. This is partly true and partly unfair. The great state workshops that had produced the magnificent sculpture of the Fourth Dynasty were disrupted. The craftsmen who had worked in them dispersed to local courts. Regional styles developed, some of them genuinely charming in their directness and individuality, even if they lack the polished grandeur of Old Kingdom masterpieces. The first intermediate period was not an aesthetic dark age. It was a period of regional diversity, which is less impressive than the unified achievement of the Old Kingdom, but is also, in its way, interesting. What the first intermediate period ultimately demonstrates is something important about Egypt as a civilization. It fell apart and it put itself back together. This would happen more than once. The capacity for collapse and restoration, for fracture and reunion, was built into the structure of Egyptian civilization in a way that was almost paradoxical. The same forces that made it great, the incredible centralization of power, the dependence on the Nile flood, the vast ambition of its projects, also made it vulnerable. When those forces failed, the civilization bent dangerously, but it had not yet broken. The men who would put it back together came from Thebes, and their story begins the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom, Egypt reborn. The reunification of Egypt came through war, and the war came from the south. The rulers of Thebes, operating under the banner of the 11th dynasty, had been extending their control northward through Upper Egypt during the later decades of the first intermediate period. The decisive confrontation came under the Theban ruler Mentuhotep II, who launched a military campaign that defeated the Heracleopolitan kingdom and reunited Egypt around 2055 before the Common Era. Mentuhotep II then went on to rule a unified Egypt for more than 50 years, one of the longest and most consequential reigns in Egyptian history. The Middle Kingdom, stretching from roughly 2055 to 1750, before the Common Era, is sometimes described as the classical age of Egyptian literature and culture. This is not an exaggeration. The texts written during the Middle Kingdom became the standard of correct literary Egyptian against which all later writing was measured. The stories, hymns, teachings, and poems of this period were copied and studied for the next 1,500 years in Egyptian scribal schools. If you wanted to know what elegant, correct, refined Egyptian sounded like, you read Middle Kingdom literature. What does Middle Kingdom literature tell us? It tells us about a society that had been deeply shaken by the chaos of the first intermediate period and was still working through the psychological consequences. The great literary texts of the 12th dynasty include works that are preoccupied with questions of meaning, suffering, justice, and the proper relationship between the individual and the state. The story of Sinuhe, probably the most beloved narrative text in ancient Egyptian literature, tells of a court official who flees Egypt after the death of his pharaoh, lives in exile in the Levant for many years, builds a life abroad, and then returns home to die in his own country. It is, among other things, a meditation on identity and belonging, on what it means to be Egyptian, and on the pull of home even after decades of absence. The dialogue of a man with his own soul is even more striking. A man contemplates suicide in response to his suffering, and engages in an internal debate about whether death is preferable to life. It is a text of remarkable psychological sophistication. It engages with questions about the afterlife, the nature of happiness, and the worth of human existence with a directness and intellectual honesty that feels, frankly, modern. The ancient Egyptians are often pictured as serene, death-obsessed, and somewhat remote. The Middle Kingdom literary tradition tells a different story. These were people who worried, who doubted, who struggled with the meaning of their existence, and who wrote about it with extraordinary skill. The 12th dynasty, which came to power around 1985 before the Common Era, was the political heart of the Middle Kingdom. Its founder, Amenemhat I, reorganized the administration, reduced the power of the nomarchs, and reasserted central royal authority. He moved the capital to a new site he built himself, Ichtawi, near the entrance to the Fayum oasis south of Memphis. He and his successors introduced a practice that would become a standard tool of Egyptian statecraft, the co-regency, in which the reigning pharaoh appointed his chosen successor as co-ruler during his own lifetime, ensuring a smooth transfer of power and preventing the succession disputes that had contributed to earlier instability. The 12th dynasty pharaohs were not builders of enormous pyramids on the scale of the Old Kingdom. They built pyramids, yes, but smaller ones, and they built them with mud brick cores faced with stone rather than solid stone throughout. The Middle Kingdom's greatness was expressed less in the scale of its architecture than in the quality of its art, the sophistication of its literature, and the efficiency of its administration. The jewellery produced during the 12th dynasty, found in royal and noble tombs at Dashur and Lahoun, is among the most technically accomplished goldsmith work of the ancient world. Delicate inlaid pieces using carnelian, lapis lazuli, and turquoise set in gold with a precision that modern jewellers have difficulty replicating. The portrait statues of Middle Kingdom pharaohs, particularly those of Sesostris III, show faces of remarkable individuality and psychological depth. These are not the serene, idealized faces of Old Kingdom royal portraits. They are careworn, austere, realistic faces of men who appear to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders, which, as pharaohs, they believed they did. The Middle Kingdom was also a period of military expansion and international engagement. Nubia, the land immediately south of Egypt, was conquered and controlled through a series of massive mud brick fortresses built at the Second Cataract. These fortresses are among the most impressive military installations of the ancient world. Sophisticated systems of walls, towers, ditches, and magazines that could house large garrisons and control river traffic. Egypt wanted Nubia's gold, its cattle, its timber, and its people, and the fortresses were the means by which it maintained control. In the northeast, Egypt engaged with the Levant through trade and occasionally military force. The execration texts, lists of Egypt's enemies inscribed on pottery or figurines which were then ritually smashed to break the power of those enemies through sympathetic magic, give us a surprisingly detailed picture of the political landscape of the Levant in the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era. They name cities and rulers that appear in other Near Eastern sources, confirming that Egypt was well informed about its neighbours and actively concerned with their intentions. Agriculture, always the foundation of Egyptian life, was expanded and intensified during the Middle Kingdom through major hydraulic engineering works in the Fayum. The Fayum is a large depression in the desert west of the Nile that is connected to the river by a natural channel. During the Middle Kingdom, this connection was managed and exploited to flood large areas of the Fayum Basin and create new agricultural land. The scale of this project, essentially, the reclamation of a significant portion of desert for farming through careful water management, was a remarkable feat of engineering and planning. The Fayum became one of the most productive agricultural regions in Egypt and would remain so for the rest of the ancient period. The Middle Kingdom ended, as the Old Kingdom had ended, not in triumph, but in fragmentation. The later 13th dynasty saw a rapid succession of short-lived pharaohs, a sign of political instability at the centre. The great nomarch families, reduced during the 12th dynasty, reasserted themselves, and from the northeast a new and unfamiliar force began to press into the delta. A people the Egyptians called Heka Kasut, rulers of foreign lands. We know them as the Hyksos. The Hyksos, the horse, and the second collapse. The Hyksos are one of the most misunderstood groups in Egyptian history. For centuries, ancient Egyptian sources presented them as savage invaders who descended on Egypt without warning, conquered it by force, and subjected its people to brutal foreign rule. Modern archaeology tells a more nuanced story, but the basic fact of foreign domination is not in dispute. For roughly 100 years, a significant portion of Egypt was ruled by people who were not Egyptian, and this experience left a mark on the Egyptian psyche that never fully healed. The Hyksos were not a single ethnic group, but a mixture of Semitic-speaking peoples from the Levant, who had been migrating into the eastern Nile Delta in significant numbers during the later Middle Kingdom. This migration was not initially hostile. The Delta had always been more open to foreign influences than Upper Egypt, more connected by trade and movement to the world of the Levant and the eastern Mediterranean. Foreign merchants settled there. Foreign craftsmen worked there. The line between resident alien and invader was not always sharply drawn. But by around 1750 before the Common Era, the political weakness of the later 13th dynasty had created an opportunity. The Hyksos rulers, who had established themselves in the delta town of Avaris, declared themselves pharaohs, adopted Egyptian royal titles and administrative practices, and established what Egyptologists call the 15th dynasty. They ruled from Avaris and extended their control over much of Lower Egypt, and eventually into parts of Upper Egypt. The Hyksos brought with them technology that Egypt had not previously possessed: the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, made of layers of different materials laminated together to give it far greater power and range than a simple wooden bow. New types of bronze weapons, including the kepesh, a curved sword that became one of the iconic weapons of the Egyptian New Kingdom, and new musical instruments, the lyre and the lute among them, which enriched Egyptian musical culture. The Hyksos also introduced new crops and new breeds of cattle. The chariot deserves special attention because it transformed warfare. A horse-drawn chariot carrying a driver and an archer, moving at high speed across a battlefield, was something no army had a ready answer for unless it had chariots of its own. The mobility and shock power of chariot forces gave their users an enormous tactical advantage. Egypt before the Hyksos had no horses and no chariots. Egypt after the Hyksos had both, in large quantities. The trauma of Hyksos conquest led directly to the military revolution of the New Kingdom, when Egypt built a chariot army that became the most powerful military force in the ancient Near East. Thebes, in Upper Egypt, remained independent under a line of rulers known as the 17th dynasty. These Theban rulers paid tribute to the Hyksos, and coexisted uneasily with them for a generation or more, but the situation was inherently unstable. Egyptian ideology could not comfortably accommodate a foreign pharaoh. The idea that Egypt was meant to be ruled by a legitimate Egyptian king, maintaining Ma'at against the chaos of foreign lands, was too deeply embedded in the culture to allow permanent accommodation. The resistance began in earnest under the Theban pharaohs Seqenenre-Ptah and his son Kamose in the early 16th century before the Common Era. The mummy of Seqenenre-Ptah, examined in the 19th century, shows catastrophic head wounds that were almost certainly received in battle. He may have died fighting the Hyksos. His son Kamose launched a major military campaign that pushed deep into Hyksos territory, and his campaigns are recorded in 2 large stone stelae that celebrate his victories. Kamose died before completing the reconquest. It was left to Kamose's brother Ahmose I, who became the founder of the 18th dynasty and the New Kingdom, to finish the job. After a siege of several years, Ahmose captured Avaris and expelled the Hyksos from Egypt around 1550 before the Common Era. He then pursued them into the Levant, further eliminating their military capacity. Egypt was reunified, and this time, the new rulers were determined that what had happened would never happen again. They would build a buffer of conquered territories in the Levant, they would maintain a professional army, and they would project Egyptian power outward with an aggression that the Middle and Old Kingdoms had never quite matched. The New Kingdom had begun. The New Kingdom, Egypt at the height of its power. The New Kingdom, stretching from approximately 1550 to 1070 before the Common Era, is the Egypt of popular imagination. It is the Egypt of chariots and gold, of vast temple complexes and royal mummies preserved for 3,000 years. It is the Egypt of Tutankhamun and Rameses and Cleopatra, though Cleopatra came much later. It is the Egypt that reached the greatest extent of its power and influence, projecting its authority across the Levant and deep into Nubia, building monuments on a scale that rivaled the pyramids, and producing art and literature of extraordinary richness and beauty. The driving engine of New Kingdom expansion was the memory of the Hyksos. Never again. That was the lesson that Ahmose and his successors drew from the humiliation of foreign occupation. Never again would Egypt be vulnerable to invasion from the northeast. The only way to prevent that was to control the territory from which any invasion might come. So the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty launched a series of military campaigns into the Levant that extended Egyptian power and influence as far north as the Euphrates River. Thutmose I, The grandfather of the famous Hatshepsut reached the Euphrates and set up a victory stealer beside it. When he saw the river flowing in the wrong direction, from north to south rather than the Nile's south to north, he reportedly called it the inverted water, which from an Egyptian perspective was a perfectly reasonable response to a river that worked backwards. The military campaigns of the New Kingdom were not merely raids. They were the foundation of an empire. Vassal states in the Levant paid tribute and acknowledged Egyptian overlordship. Egyptian garrisons were stationed at strategic points. Egyptian officials oversaw the administration of key territories. Sons of Levantine rulers were brought to the Egyptian court to be educated, forming personal bonds with the pharaoh and his family, while simultaneously being detached from their home communities. This system of soft power combined with hard military force created a genuine sphere of Egyptian influence, stretching from the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south to modern-day Syria in the north. The wealth that flowed into Egypt from this empire was enormous. Tribute from Nubia in gold, cattle, and enslaved people. Tribute from the Levant in silver, timber, horses, and luxury goods. The spoils of military campaigns. Gifts exchanged between the Egyptian court and other great powers, the Hittites of Anatolia, the Mitanni of northern Syria, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Mycenaean Greeks of the Aegean. The Egyptian court of the 18th dynasty was connected to a vast network of international exchange, and the correspondence between these courts, preserved in the diplomatic archive discovered at Tel El Amarna in 1887, gives us a detailed and sometimes surprisingly personal picture of great power politics in the mid-14th century before the Common Era. The Amarna letters, as this archive is known, include letters from the kings of Babylon complaining that Egypt has not sent enough gold. Gold, one Babylonian king writes, is like dust in Egypt. Just send some. There are letters from the rulers of minor Levantine city-states begging the pharaoh to send troops to deal with troublesome neighbours or threatening bandits. There are formal diplomatic exchanges, marriage negotiations, and complaints about protocol. Reading the Amarna letters is one of the genuinely strange pleasures of ancient history. You're reading actual correspondence between actual rulers, more than 3,000 years old, about concerns that are in some ways not so different from the concerns of modern diplomats. The wealth and power of the New Kingdom expressed itself most magnificently at Karnak. The temple complex at Karnak, dedicated primarily to the god Amun-Ra, grew over the course of the New Kingdom into the largest religious complex ever built. It covers more than 2 square kilometres. Its great hypostyle hall, built primarily during the 19th dynasty under Seti I and Rameses II, contains 134 massive columns arranged in 16 rows. The largest columns are 24 metres tall and have a circumference of 15 metres. To walk through the hypostyle hall today is an overwhelming experience. The columns loom above you like a stone forest, their surfaces covered from base to capital with carved reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions, all originally painted in bright colours that have mostly faded or been lost, but that must have made the hall blazing with colour in its working days. It is one of the most impressive interiors ever created by human hands, and I say that as someone who has been inside several very impressive interiors. Across the Nile from Karnak, on the west bank at Thebes, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom built their tombs, not pyramids this time. The pyramid form had proved ineffective as protection for royal burials. Every accessible pyramid had been robbed in antiquity. The New Kingdom solution was to separate the tomb from the mortuary temple, hiding the burial deep in the cliffs of a remote valley, the Valley of the Kings, while building the mortuary temple separately on the edge of the cultivation. It was a reasonable idea. It did not entirely work. Most of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings were eventually robbed as well, but the tombs themselves, cut deep into the limestone cliffs and decorated with extraordinary paintings and reliefs depicting the journey of the deceased through the underworld, are among the greatest artistic achievements of ancient Egypt, and one of them, as we will discuss shortly, was found almost completely intact. Daily life in New Kingdom Egypt was, for many people, considerably more comfortable than it had been in earlier periods. The agricultural base remained the foundation of everything, but the influx of tribute and trade goods from the empire meant that a wider range of materials was available. Artisans in the royal workshops produced objects of extraordinary quality for an elite clientele. The workers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings lived in a purpose-built village at Deir el-Medina, on the west bank of Thebes, and left behind the largest archive of personal documents from any ancient Egyptian community. From Deir el-Medina we have work records, letters, legal documents, love poetry, and accounts of workplace disputes that give us an unusually intimate view of ordinary life in New Kingdom Egypt. The Deir el-Medina workers were not typical Egyptians. They were skilled craftsmen, among the best in the country, who worked on the most important construction projects in the land. But their documents reveal concerns and behaviours that are recognisably human. Workers called in sick, sometimes legitimately, sometimes perhaps less so. There are records of a worker absent because he was brewing beer. There are love poems of genuine lyrical beauty. There are letters between family members that express affection and anxiety in ways that are immediately comprehensible. There are records of theft, adultery, and labour disputes. The New Kingdom was not a world of serene ancient automatons performing divine rituals in ceremonial silence. It was a world of people, with all the complexity that implies. Hatshepsut, the woman who became pharaoh. Among the most remarkable figures in all of ancient history, not just Egyptian history, stands Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmosis I, wife of Thutmosis II, and then, in one of the most audacious moves in the ancient world, ruler of Egypt in her own name as pharaoh during the early 18th dynasty. Her story is one of ambition, intelligence, and a fascinating relationship with power. And for 3,000 years it was almost completely hidden. When Thutmosis II died around 1479 before the Common Era, his heir was a young boy, Thutmosis III, son of a secondary wife rather than of Hatshepsut herself. The boy was too young to rule independently, so Hatshepsut, as his stepmother and as the daughter of the previous pharaoh, acted as regent. This was not unusual. Royal women had served as regents before in Egyptian history. What was unusual was what happened next. Within a few years of the regency beginning, Hatshepsut began to appear in official contexts not as regent, but as pharaoh. She took the royal titles. She wore the double crown. She wore the ceremonial beard. She called herself the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. The ceremonial beard is worth pausing on for a moment. Egyptian pharaohs wore a false beard as part of their royal regalia. It was a symbol of authority, not an actual facial characteristic. When Hatshepsut represented herself as pharaoh, she wore this beard in her official images. She also, in most of her representations, used male grammatical forms in the hieroglyphic text that described her. But not always. Some texts describe her as female, and some images show her clearly as a woman in female dress. The inconsistency is not confusion on the part of the ancient Egyptians. It reflects the genuine novelty of the situation. There was no existing template for a female pharaoh in the way that there was for a female regent. The Egyptians were improvising, and the improvisation produced some fascinating inconsistencies. Hatshepsut's reign lasted approximately 22 years, making it one of the longest of the 18th dynasty. It was by any measure a successful reign. She launched extensive building programs, including the magnificent terraced mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari on the west bank of Thebes, which is considered one of the most elegant buildings in the ancient world. She sent a major trading expedition to the land of Punt, a semi-legendary place to the south and east of Egypt that may correspond to the modern Horn of Africa region, and brought back incense trees, ebony, gold, ivory, and living animals. The scenes depicting this expedition, carved on the walls of her Deir el-Bahari temple, are among the most charming and detailed in all of Egyptian art. We see the Egyptians arriving by boat. We see the local leaders of Punt meeting them. We see the goods being loaded. We even see the Queen of Punt, depicted with a physique that the Egyptians clearly found noteworthy. Whether as unusual or as a mark of wealth and status is debated. Hatshepsut's most important relationship, and in some ways her most complicated legacy, was with her chief steward and later co-administrator Senenmut. Senenmut was a man of non-royal birth who rose to become one of the most powerful individuals in Egypt, serving as the overseer of numerous royal projects and holding an extraordinary number of official titles. He's shown in statues with Hatshepsut's daughter Neferu-Ra in ways that indicate a close personal relationship with the royal family. Whether he and Hatshepsut had a romantic relationship is a question that Egyptologists have debated with varying degrees of enthusiasm for decades. There are graffiti near Deir el-Bahari that appear to depict a sexual relationship between a figure identified as Senenmut and a female figure, which suggests that at least some ancient Egyptians thought they did. The honest answer is that we do not know, and probably never will. After Hatshepsut's death, something strange happened. Beginning about 20 years after her death, a systematic effort was made to remove her name and image from the monument she had built. Her statues were smashed and buried. Her cartouches were chiselled out of inscriptions and replaced with those of Thutmose I, the second, or the third. For centuries, this destruction was interpreted as the act of a vengeful Thutmose III, settling scores with the woman who had effectively sidelined him during his youth. Modern scholarship has revised this interpretation significantly. The destruction of Hatshepsut's monuments appears to have begun near the end of Thutmose III's reign, or possibly under his son Amenhotep II, and was probably motivated not by personal revenge but by dynastic politics. Hatshepsut had presented herself as a full pharaoh. If the concept of a female pharaoh became normalized through her example, it might create political complications in the future. Better to remove the precedent from the record. The pragmatics of legitimacy, not personal hatred, was probably the driving motive. But the destruction was not complete. Hatshepsut's monuments survived in enough quantity that when archaeologists began studying the 18th dynasty in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they could piece together her story. The process of identifying her was itself remarkable. Egyptologist Howard Carter, before his famous discovery of Tutankhamun, was already working to understand the mysterious female pharaoh whose presence lurked behind the altered inscriptions. Later scholars, including the Egyptologist Herbert Winlock and eventually the Metropolitan Museum of Art's excavations, recovered the smashed statues from the pit where they had been buried and began the painstaking work of reconstruction. Today, Hatshepsut is one of the most recognized figures of the ancient world. Her story has inspired books, documentaries, and considerable public interest. She stands as proof that Egyptian society, for all its conservatism and adherence to tradition, could produce genuinely radical departures from expected norms when circumstances and personal ability combined in the right way. She ruled for 22 years. She built extraordinary monuments. She expanded Egypt's trade networks. And she did it while presenting herself in the male-coded regalia of a pharaoh, insisting on the legitimacy of her rule in a form the Egyptian system could understand, even if it had never quite seen it before. Akhenaten and the Heretic King, Egypt's religious revolution. If Hatshepsut represents the power of individual will operating within Egyptian tradition, then the pharaoh who came roughly a century after her represents something entirely different. Akhenaten, born Amenhotep IV, represents the power of individual will operating in direct opposition to Egyptian tradition. His reign, lasting from roughly 1353 to 1336 before the Common Era, was one of the most extraordinary and disruptive episodes in 3,000 years of Egyptian history. He changed everything, and then, after his death, everything changed back. To understand what Akhenaten did, you need to understand the religious landscape of the new kingdom before him. Egypt had always been a polytheistic society, worshipping a large and complex pantheon of gods. By the new kingdom, the most powerful deity in that pantheon was Amun, or Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, whose great temple at Karnak was the wealthiest institution in Egypt. The priesthood of Amun had accumulated land, gold, grain, and political influence on a scale that rivaled the pharaoh himself. Some scholars have argued that the growing power of the Amun priesthood was the context that made Akhenaten's religious revolution politically as well as theologically motivated. Whether or not that is the whole story, it is certainly part of it. Early in his reign, Amenhotep IV began to show a special devotion to the Aten, the solar disk, an aspect of the sun god that had been worshipped for centuries but had never been a major deity. He elevated the Aten to a position of supreme importance, presenting it not as one god among many but as the sole true god, the only source of all life. In approximately his 5th year as pharaoh, he changed his name from Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning effective spirit of the Aten. He declared that the existing gods, particularly Amun, were not merely secondary, but were false. He ordered the names of Amun chiseled out of inscriptions throughout Egypt. He built a new capital city from scratch in the desert, a virgin site on the east bank of the Nile in Middle Egypt that he called Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, known today as Tel El Amarna. Akhetaten was built with extraordinary speed, rising from empty desert to functional city in perhaps 2 years. It was designed as a sacred space dedicated entirely to the Aten, with open-air temples where worship could be conducted in sunlight rather than in the dark inner sanctuaries of traditional Egyptian temples. The pharaoh and his beautiful chief queen Nefertiti were the intermediaries through whom the Aten's grace flowed to humanity. In Akhenaten's theology, Ordinary people could not pray to the Aten directly. They prayed to Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who prayed to the Aten. The pharaoh had inserted himself as an essential step in the chain between divinity and humanity, which is either profound theology or the most elaborate job security scheme in human history, depending on your perspective. The art of the Amarna period is immediately recognizable and utterly unlike anything produced before or after in Egypt. In Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom, and most of New Kingdom art, the human figure was presented in the canonical Egyptian style, frontal torso combined with profile limbs and face, formal, idealized, timeless. Amarna art broke with this tradition in a startling way. Royal figures were depicted with elongated skulls, long thin faces, protruding bellies, wide hips and soft rounded bodies. Akhenaten himself was shown with exaggeratedly feminine features, to a degree that has prompted some scholars to suggest he had a medical condition affecting his hormonal balance, and others to suggest that the elongated forms were purely artistic and theological, representing the pharaoh as a being who transcended ordinary gender categories, the vessel of divine creative energy. What gives the Amarna artistic revolution its particular power is not the strangeness of the royal images, but the humanity of the intimate scenes. For the first time in Egyptian royal art, the pharaoh was shown playing with his daughters, dandling them on his knee, kissing them, receiving them as they climbed on his lap. Nefertiti was shown in poses of physical affection with her husband. The royal family was depicted as a real family. This was unprecedented. Egyptian royal art was normally entirely formal. The sudden appearance of genuine tenderness in these images is striking and rather moving, whatever you think of Akhenaten's theology. What happened to the rest of Egypt during Akhenaten's reign? The evidence suggests that the country largely kept going, because Egypt was very good at keeping going, but that the disruption caused by the religious revolution was real and damaging. The temples of the traditional gods were closed, their priesthoods were disbanded or drastically reduced. The massive state resources that had flowed to Karnak and the other great religious institutions were redirected to the Atene's cult at Akhetaten. For the people who depended on those institutions, economically, socially and spiritually, this was a genuine catastrophe. Foreign affairs also suffered. The Amarna letters include urgent appeals from Egypt's Levantine vassals for military help against various threats, appeals that appear to have gone largely unanswered during Akhenaten's later years. Egypt's empire in the Levant, while not lost, was neglected. The Hittite Empire to the north was expanding, filling the vacuum left by Egyptian inattention. Akhenaten died around 1336 before the Common Era. What happened to him is not entirely clear. Whether he died of natural causes, was deposed, or was murdered is unknown. He was succeeded by a short-lived ruler named Smenkhar, whose relationship to the royal family is debated, and then by his young son, the most famous of all Egyptian pharaohs, Tutankhamun. The dismantling of Akhenaten's revolution began immediately. The court returned to Thebes. The traditional temples were reopened. The Aten's temples were closed. And within a generation the effort to erase Akhenaten from history, to destroy his monuments and his inscriptions, was underway. He became known simply as the criminal of Akhetaten. His name was not to be spoken, but the city of Akhetaten, rapidly abandoned after his death, preserved itself in the desert. The sand covered it. No one lived there. No one built over it. And when archaeologists discovered it in the 19th century, they found a remarkably complete picture of this extraordinary moment. The Amarna letters were found there, the workshops of the royal sculptor Thutmose, including the famous painted limestone bust of Nefertiti that is now in Berlin, were found there. The outlines of the city's temples and palaces were revealed by excavation. Akhetaten, erased from official history, spoke again from the sand. Tutankhamun, the boy king and the greatest discovery. In 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter entered a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings and changed the world. The tomb was that of the minor pharaoh Tutankhamun, and what Carter found inside it generated a degree of public excitement about ancient Egypt that has never entirely subsided. Before we talk about the discovery, though, we should talk about the boy king himself, who has been rather overshadowed by the treasure that bears his name. Tutankhamun was born around 1341 before the Common Era, almost certainly as the son of Akhenaten. His mother's identity has been debated, but DNA analysis of the royal mummies has suggested that she may have been the younger lady mummy found in tomb KV35, herself possibly a daughter of Amenhotep III, which would make Tutankhamun the product of a sibling union, a practice that was not unknown in the Egyptian royal family. He came to the throne as a child, probably around 9 years old, and ruled for approximately 9 or 10 years before dying, probably at around 18 or 19 years of age. His death, like so much about him, has been the subject of enormous speculation. Was he murdered? For decades this was a popular theory, fueled partly by the absence of a clear heir, and partly by the political circumstances of his court, which was dominated by two powerful older men, the General Horemheb and the official heir. CT scans of his mummy, conducted in 2005, revealed that he had suffered a badly broken leg shortly before his death, which had become infected. Later analysis found evidence of malaria. The current consensus is that he probably died from a combination of illness and injury rather than murder. He was not a robust young man. Analysis of his skeletal remains shows evidence of multiple medical conditions, probably related to generations of inbreeding within the royal family. During his brief reign, Tutankhamun presided over the formal reversal of Akhenaten's revolution. The court returned to Thebes. The temples of Amun and the other traditional gods were reopened and restored. The young king changed his name from Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. He is pictured on the golden throne found in his tomb, receiving an affectionate gesture from his wife and queen, Ankhesenamun, who was herself a daughter of Akhenaten. They look young, these two figures on the throne. Young and rather touching, a boy king and a queen who had both grown up in the extraordinary circumstances of Amarna, now trying to navigate a return to normality. After Tutankhamun's death, the two powerful men who had dominated his court took turns on the throne. I, elderly and probably Nefertiti's father, ruled briefly. Then Horemheb, the general, ruled for decades, continuing the erasure of Akhenaten's memory and systematically dismantling what remained of the Amarna period's legacy. He also had no children, and his successor was his own chosen military colleague Rameses I, who founded the 19th dynasty. Now, the discovery. On the 4th of November 1922, Carter's team was excavating beneath the remains of some ancient workmen's huts in the Valley of the Kings when they uncovered a step cut into the bedrock. More steps, a corridor, a sealed doorway bearing intact royal seals. Carter sent a telegram to his patron, Lord Carnarvon, who was in England, telling him to come to Egypt immediately. Carnarvon arrived, and on the 26th of November 1922, Carter made a small hole in the sealed inner door and held a candle to the opening. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Carnarvon asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter reportedly replied, "Yes, wonderful things." What Carter could see, dimly by candlelight, were gilded surfaces, glittering gold, statues and objects piled in a profusion that made no immediate sense because no one had expected anything like this. The antechamber of Tutankhamun's tomb, the first room entered, contained over 700 objects arranged in an extraordinary jumble, as if someone had packed up an entire palace in a hurry. Golden couches in the shapes of animals, gilded chariots disassembled and stacked, boxes and chests of every description, alabaster vessels, model boats, ceremonial chairs, bouquets of dried flowers, and two life-size wooden statues of the king standing guard on either side of the sealed doorway that led to the burial chamber. The clearance of the tomb took 10 years. Carter, meticulous to a degree that was both admirable and occasionally maddening to his colleagues, documented every object before it was moved. Every item was photographed, described, and numbered. The process was a model of careful excavation. The burial chamber itself contained the nested shrines, 4 of them fitting inside each other like Russian dolls, each made of gilded wood that encased the stone sarcophagus. Inside the sarcophagus were 3 nested coffins. The innermost coffin was solid gold, 110 kilograms of it. Inside that coffin was the mummy of the king, wearing the famous golden death mask, the most recognizable object in ancient Egyptian art. The mask is extraordinary. Made of solid gold inlaid with coloured glass and gemstones, it is a portrait of the young king with idealized features. The eyes are inlaid with obsidian and glass. The striped headdress of blue and gold glass is perfectly preserved. The expression is serene, ageless, and somehow deeply affecting. You're looking at an object made specifically to protect the face of a specific young man for eternity, and it has done exactly that for 3,300 years. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb transformed public understanding of and enthusiasm for ancient Egypt. Newspapers around the world covered every stage of the clearance. Egyptian motifs swept through 1920s design in a craze known as Egyptomania. Museums around the world have displayed Tutankhamun's treasures, and wherever they travel, they draw enormous crowds. A boy who ruled for 9 years, who died at 18 or 19, who was so thoroughly removed from official history that his name was unknown to scholars until the early 20th century, has become the most famous individual from the ancient world. History has a sense of humour. Ramesses the Great, the last giant. The 19th dynasty pharaoh, Ramesses II, who ruled from approximately 1279 to 1213 before the Common Era, a reign of 66 years, was arguably the greatest self-promoter in the history of the ancient world. He built more, inscribed more, claimed more, and represented himself more grandly than any pharaoh before or after. His colossal statues dotted Egypt from the Delta to Nubia. His name appears on monuments built by his predecessors, because he did not let small things like attribution stop him from claiming credit. He had 96 sons and 60 daughters. He lived to approximately 90 years of age, dying when most of his heirs had already predeceased him. And his mummy, found in the 19th century and now in the Cairo Museum, still shows a strong, hawk-nosed face that radiates a kind of imperious vitality even after 3,000 years. Ramesses II was a force of nature, and the force was largely directed toward telling everyone how great Ramesses II was. The centerpiece of Ramesses' military career was the Battle of Kadesh, fought in approximately 1274 before the Common Era against the Hittite Empire in what is now Syria. The battle is the best documented military engagement in the ancient world, described in multiple Egyptian texts and depicted in temple reliefs throughout Egypt. According to the Egyptian account, Ramesses personally led his forces into a Hittite ambush, was surrounded, and through his own superhuman courage and divine protection from Amun, fought his way out and essentially won the battle single-handedly. It is a magnificent story. It is probably only partly true. The Hittite records, preserved in the Hittite capital of Hattusa in modern Turkey, tell a rather different version of the battle, one in which the Hittites inflicted significant damage on the Egyptian forces. Modern analysis of the battle suggests that it was effectively a draw, with neither side achieving a decisive victory. Ramesses led his army into a dangerously poor tactical position by advancing ahead of his main forces, and was genuinely surprised by the Hittite ambush. He did fight his way out, but the battle ended inconclusively, with both sides withdrawing to their respective territories. This inconclusive battle is what inspired the world's oldest surviving peace treaty. Around 1258 before the Common Era, Ramesses and the Hittite king Hattusili III negotiated what is known as the Treaty of Kadesh, a formal agreement that established a peace between the two powers, defined boundaries, and included mutual defense provisions. Copies of the treaty were found both in Egypt and in the Hittite archives. A copy of the treaty hangs today in the United Nations headquarters in New York, as a symbol of the ancient tradition of international diplomacy, which means that the world's oldest surviving peace treaty is partially a response to Ramesses' mistake in attacking without adequate intelligence. There is a lesson in there somewhere. Ramesses' building program was extraordinary by any standard. His mortuary temple, the Ramesseum on the west bank of Thebes, was a massive complex of stone and mud brick. His additions to the temple at Karnak were enormous. He built a new capital city in the Delta, Per-Ramesses, the House of Ramesses, which became one of the largest cities in the ancient world. But his most famous building project is Abu Simbel, 2 rock-cut temples carved directly into the cliffs of a sandstone mountain in Nubia, near the modern border between Egypt and Sudan. The Great Temple at Abu Simbel is fronted by 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses himself, each approximately 20 meters tall. They are unambiguous. They say, without any possibility of misunderstanding, that this is Ramesses' land, Ramesses' river, Ramesses' sky. The temple was oriented so that twice a year, on dates thought to correspond to Ramesses' birthday and coronation day, the rising sun would penetrate the entire length of the temple, through the entrance, down the long central corridor, and illuminate the statues in the innermost sanctuary. This solar alignment, achieved in a mountain over 3,000 years ago, still works today. Though the temple was moved in the 1960s to save it from the rising waters of Lake Nasser created by the Aswan High Dam, the smaller temple at Abu Simbel was dedicated to the goddess Hathor and to Ramesses' chief queen Nefertari, about whom we know more than about almost any other Egyptian queen thanks to the extraordinary tomb that Ramesses built for her in the Valley of the Queens. The tomb of Nefertari is covered from floor to ceiling with paintings of such brilliance and quality that they are considered among the finest artistic achievements of the ancient world. The colours, protected for centuries by dry desert conditions, were still vivid when the tomb was discovered. They have since required careful conservation work, but the images, Nefertari in her white robes and elaborate headdress, accompanied by gods through the landscape of the afterlife, remain deeply beautiful. The long reign of Ramesses II left Egypt in a position that looked strong from the outside. Grand monuments, an extended empire, a heroic pharaoh. But the underlying reality was more complicated. The empire in the Levant required constant attention and military commitment that Egypt could not indefinitely sustain. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's main rival, was itself under pressure from new forces. The Bronze Age world of the Eastern Mediterranean, the world of which Ramesses was the greatest ornament, was in the early stages of a crisis that would eventually destroy it. Ramesses died around 1213 before the Common Era. He was succeeded by his 13th son, Meremptah, who had outlived all 12 of his older brothers. Meremptah faced, early in his reign, a major incursion into the western delta by Libyan peoples, accompanied by other groups from the north. He defeated this incursion and recorded his victory on a large granite stela. Among the lists of defeated peoples and cities on this stela, one entry reads, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more." This is the first and for a long time the only mention of Israel in any ancient Egyptian text, and it is part of what is known as the Meremptah Stela, or the Israel Stela. The entry is brief, almost offhand, and has generated an enormous amount of scholarly and public discussion about its implications for biblical history. Meremptah was followed by a series of short-lived pharaohs, a sign that the vitality of the Ramesside dynasty was fading. The 19th dynasty eventually gave way to the 20th, under which one more great Ramesses, Ramesses III, would hold off the forces gathering at Egypt's borders before the final collapse came. The Sea Peoples and the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 before the Common Era, something happened to the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean that was so catastrophic, so wide-ranging, and so difficult to explain that historians and archaeologists are still debating it. Major cities were destroyed, palaces were burned, trade networks collapsed. The Hittite Empire, which had been one of the great powers of the ancient world for centuries, disappeared so completely that its existence was forgotten until modern archaeology rediscovered it. The Mycenaean Greek civilization, the world of the Iliad and the Odyssey, collapsed and entered a dark age from which it would not emerge for centuries. Cyprus was devastated. Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the Levant, was burned and never reoccupied. Egypt did not fall, but it came close, and it was transformed in ways from which it never fully recovered. The pharaoh Ramesses III, ruling in the early 12th century before the Common Era, is the most important figure in the Egyptian response to this crisis. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu on the west bank of Thebes is the best preserved major temple in Egypt, and its walls are covered with inscriptions and reliefs that describe, in vivid detail, the threats he faced and the victories he claimed. Among those threats were the Sea Peoples. This is the name given by modern scholars to a group or groups of peoples whose origins remain genuinely unclear. The Egyptian sources describe them as coming from islands and from the sea, attacking by land and water in coordinated campaigns of extraordinary scale. Their ethnic and geographic origins have been debated extensively. Some of them, based on Egyptian depictions and their own material culture found in the archaeological record, appear to have connections to the Aegean world, to the Mycenaean Greeks and related peoples. Others appear to have Anatolian, Cypriot or Levantine connections. Ramesses III fought two major campaigns against these peoples, depicted at Medinet Habu with a detail and energy that makes them among the most vivid military scenes in ancient art. The land battle shows Egyptian infantry and chariots engaging figures in distinctive feathered headdresses. The sea battle, depicted in the temple's large courtyard, shows Egyptian ships engaging Sea People ships in what appears to have been a major naval engagement in the eastern delta. The Egyptians claimed victory in both engagements. The sea battle in particular, if it happened roughly as depicted, would represent one of the earliest naval battles in recorded history. Ramesses III defeated the Sea Peoples, at least in the sense that Egypt was not overrun as so many other societies had been. But the cost was enormous, and the aftermath was damaging. The Levantine territories that had been part of Egypt's empire were effectively lost. Egyptian garrisons in the region either withdrew or were cut off. The tribute from the empire stopped flowing. The wealth that had sustained Egypt's monumental building programs dried up. The state granaries that had been the backbone of Egyptian economic and social stability became increasingly strained. A remarkable document from the late reign of Rameses III reveals the strains in a very direct way. A papyrus records what appears to be the first labour strike in recorded history. The workers at Deir el-Medina, the craftsmen who built the royal tombs, stopped work and demonstrated because their grain rations had not been delivered. Their phrase for this, according to the papyrus, was, "We are hungry." Not a complex demand, not a political manifesto, just workers informing their supervisors that they had not been paid and that they needed food. The ration system that had reliably fed the workers for centuries had broken down. This was a symptom, not a cause, of a deeper problem. The Egyptian state was running short of the resources it needed to maintain its promises to its people. Rameses III was also, according to the Harem Conspiracy Papyrus, the target of an assassination attempt organised from within his own harem by a secondary queen who wanted to place her son on the throne, rather than the designated crown prince. The conspiracy involved officials, military officers, and even harem women equipped with magical texts to use against the king. Whether the conspiracy succeeded is unclear. Rameses III may have died from his wounds, or may have died of natural causes shortly after the plot was uncovered. The conspirators were put on trial in a remarkable legal proceeding whose records survive, and most of them were condemned to death or to cutting off their noses, which seems like it might have been preferable actually. After Rameses III, the 20th dynasty consisted of a series of pharaohs all named Rameses, from Rameses IV through Rameses XI, a succession that tells you something about the dynasty's lack of originality, but rather more about the degree to which the name Rameses had become a talisman of royal legitimacy. These later Ramesside pharaohs ruled over an Egypt that was shrinking both in territory and in royal authority. The high priests of Amun at Karnak were growing so powerful that by the reign of Rameses XI, the high priest Herihor was effectively ruling Upper Egypt, using royal titles and depicting himself in pharaonic style in temple reliefs. The pharaoh's power, always theoretically absolute, had been hollowed out from within. Around 1070 before the Common Era, the New Kingdom ended. Not with a dramatic collapse or a foreign conquest, but simply by running out of steam. The long story that had begun with Ahmose driving out the Hyksos continued through the empire of the 18th dynasty, the religious revolution of Akhenaten, the golden grandeur of Ramesses II, and the desperate battles of Rameses III came to a quiet, exhausted end. The Third Intermediate Period, fragmentation and foreign pharaohs. The Third Intermediate Period, stretching from approximately 1070 to 664 before the Common Era, is one of the least studied and least glamorous periods in Egyptian history. This is a pity because it is genuinely fascinating in a complicated and somewhat chaotic way. 400 years of political fragmentation, competing dynasties, foreign pharaohs, and regional power struggles, during which Egypt managed to remain culturally recognizable while being politically almost unrecognizable. The fundamental problem of the Third Intermediate Period was division. Egypt was split between north and south, and sometimes into more fragments than that. In the north, the pharaohs of the 21st dynasty ruled from Tanis, a city in the eastern delta near the site of the old Hyksos capital of Avaris. In the south, the high priest of Amun governed Thebes as virtually independent rulers, sometimes marrying into the royal family and sometimes competing with it. The two halves of the country maintained a kind of uneasy coexistence, connected by kinship ties, shared religion, and the inertia of tradition, but not by genuine central authority. The royal tombs of the 21st dynasty at Tanis were discovered in 1939 by the French archaeologist Pierre Montet, who found several intact royal burials whose golden treasures rival those of Tutankhamun. These Tanis treasures are housed in the Cairo Museum but are far less famous than Tutankhamun's gold, partly because their discovery was announced in March of 1939, a few months before the German invasion of Poland, which rather dominated the international news cycle. History, as I mentioned earlier, does have a sense of humour, and sometimes it is very dark humour indeed. The 22nd dynasty introduced an entirely new element to Egyptian kingship. Its founders were Libyan. The Libyans had been a thorn in Egypt's side since the late New Kingdom, raiding the western delta and settling in the region in significant numbers over the course of generations. By the time of the 22nd dynasty, around 945 before the Common Era, a Libyan chief named Shoshonkh became pharaoh. His successors, also of Libyan descent, ruled Egypt for the next 2 centuries or so. They adopted Egyptian royal titles and religious practices with considerable enthusiasm, They continued building temples and commissioning statues. Their art and architecture are essentially indistinguishable from those of native Egyptian rulers. This is, in fact, a recurring pattern in Egyptian history. Foreign rulers, once they gained control of Egypt, tended to become Egyptian. The weight of Egypt's cultural tradition was so powerful, and the ideology of the pharaoh so central to maintaining the loyalty of the population and the functioning of the state, that even foreign conquerors found it easier to adopt Egyptian identity than to impose their own. Egypt absorbed its conquerors with a thoroughness that was almost alarming, which may explain why it survived so long. The Libyan period was not entirely peaceful. There were multiple competing dynasties operating simultaneously in different parts of the country, particularly toward its later stages. The 23rd and 24th dynasties overlapped with the 22nd in different regions. Political control fragmented further, and it was in this fragmented landscape that a new power from the south appeared and surprised everyone. The Kingdom of Kush, centered at Napata in the Sudan, had been in the Nubian territory that Egypt had controlled during the New Kingdom. When Egyptian power in Nubia collapsed at the end of the New Kingdom, the Kushites developed independently, creating a state that was deeply influenced by Egyptian culture, particularly the religious traditions of Amun's cult, but was also distinctly its own entity. By the 8th century before the Common Era, the Kushite rulers had grown powerful enough to intervene in Egypt's internal affairs. Around 744 before the Common Era, the Kushite king Pa launched a military campaign northward, defeated the fractious Egyptian rulers, and claimed authority over the whole country. The 25th dynasty, the Kushite dynasty, is one of the most interesting in Egyptian history. These were rulers from deep in Africa, from the Sudan, who were so devoted to Egyptian religious traditions that they presented themselves as purer Egyptians than the Libyans who'd been ruling Egypt for generations. They built pyramids, a form of royal burial that had been abandoned in Egypt proper since the Middle Kingdom, but which had been maintained in Nubia. The Nubian pyramids, built at Napata and later at Meroe, are steeper and more slender than the Egyptian originals, but they are unmistakably in the Egyptian tradition. The 25th dynasty pharaohs also launched a major program of temple construction and restoration throughout Egypt, presenting themselves as restorers of the proper order against the degraded state into which the Libyan rulers had allowed it to fall. The late period, Persians, revivals, and resistance. The 25th dynasty's control of Egypt was brought to an end by a new and formidable power from the northeast. The Assyrian Empire, based in what is now northern Iraq, had expanded to become the dominant military power of the Near East in the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. The Assyrians had a formidable military reputation, and their treatment of conquered peoples was deliberately harsh, designed to inspire terror as a tool of control. They clashed with the Kushite pharaohs of Egypt in a series of campaigns that the Assyrian king Esarhaddon launched in the early 7th century before the Common Era, eventually sacking Memphis and Thebes and forcing the Kushite rulers to retreat back to their Sudanese homeland. The Assyrian occupation of Egypt was not permanent. The Assyrian Empire was too large and too extended to maintain direct control of Egypt indefinitely, and within a few decades the Assyrians withdrew, leaving behind a situation in which a series of local rulers competed for power. From this competition emerged the 26th dynasty, also known as the Sate period, from its capital at Say in the western delta. The Sate pharaohs, ruling from around 664 to 525 before the Common Era, presided over one of the most interesting cultural revivals in Egyptian history. The Sate period was characterized by a self-conscious archaism. The pharaohs and artists of this period looked back to the Old and Middle Kingdoms for inspiration, deliberately reviving artistic styles, religious texts, and administrative practices that had been dormant for over 1,000 years. Old Kingdom funerary texts reappeared on coffins. Sculptural styles echoed those of the Pyramid Age. Royal titularies were composed in archaic forms. This was not mere imitation. It was a political and cultural statement, a claim that the 26th dynasty was the legitimate heir of Egypt's greatest traditions, restoring the country to its proper state after centuries of fragmentation and foreign domination. The Sate period also saw Egypt engaging more actively with the Greek world. Greek mercenaries served in the Egyptian army. Greek merchants were settled at the city of Naucratis in the Delta, one of the first examples of a purpose-built trading colony in the ancient Mediterranean. Egyptian objects and influences spread into the Greek world, influencing early Greek sculpture, in particular the Kouros figures that bear a striking resemblance to Egyptian standing male statues. Egypt and Greece were in increasingly close contact, and this contact would eventually produce consequences that neither side could have anticipated. The Sate revival was brought to an abrupt end in 525 before the Common Era, when the Persian king Cambyses invaded Egypt and defeated Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium. Egypt became a province of the Persian Empire governed by Persian satraps. The Persians were sometimes careful to present themselves in the Egyptian mode, as pharaohs maintaining the traditions of the land, and some Persian rulers, including the great Darius I, made genuine efforts to respect and support Egyptian religious institutions. But Egyptian resistance to Persian rule was fierce and recurrent. There were major revolts against Persian authority in the 5th century before the Common Era, and in 380 before the Common Era, a native Egyptian king named Amyrtius succeeded in expelling the Persians and establishing the 28th dynasty. This native Egyptian period lasted until 343 before the Common Era, during which 3 more dynasties ruled in relatively quick succession, 29th, 30th, and briefly the 31st, which was the second Persian period. The pharaohs of these last native dynasties were prolific builders and left monuments of considerable quality throughout Egypt. The 30th dynasty, Pharaoh Nectanebo II, is the last native Egyptian pharaoh, and his reign ended when the Persian king Artaxerxes III reconquered Egypt in 343 before the Common Era. Nectanebo II fled south, and Egypt was once again a Persian province. But this second Persian period would not last long. A new conqueror was already on the march, and this one would change Egypt's story more completely than any previous ruler had done. The late period as a whole is sometimes presented as Egypt in decline, a dying civilization clinging to its traditions while the world changed around it. This characterization is not entirely wrong, but it misses something important. Egypt's cultural traditions were genuinely extraordinary, and the dedication with which successive periods and successive rulers, whether Egyptian, Libyan, Kushite, or Persian, maintained those traditions testifies to their power. The temples being built in the 4th century before the Common Era were built in styles that would have been recognizable, if somewhat startling, to craftsmen of the Old Kingdom 2,000 years earlier. The religious texts being copied were older than some of the monuments they decorated. Egypt was carrying a cultural legacy of almost unimaginable weight, and it was doing so with remarkable fidelity. Alexander and the Greeks, Egypt meets the Mediterranean world. In 332 before the Common Era, Alexander III of Macedon marched into Egypt. He did not have to fight for it. The Persian satrap who governed Egypt surrendered without significant resistance. The Egyptian population, chafing under the second Persian occupation, greeted Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, and Alexander, who was extremely good at reading rooms, responded to this reception in the most effective way possible. He went to the temple. Specifically, he went to the great temple of Ptah at Memphis, where he made offerings in the traditional Egyptian manner and was apparently accepted by the priests as the legitimate king of Egypt. He then made a journey across the desert to the oasis of Siwa, where the great oracle of Amun was located. The oracle was consulted by Greeks as well as Egyptians. It was famous throughout the Mediterranean world. Alexander's visit to Siwa was a political and religious act of the first order. What exactly the oracle said to him is not recorded, but Alexander emerged from the consultation apparently satisfied. The story, probably embellished in later tradition, is that the oracle addressed him as son of God, which Alexander found agreeable. Alexander spent only a few months in Egypt. His great conquest of the Persian Empire required his attention further east, and he left Egypt in 331 before the Common Era, never to return. He died in Babylon in 323 before the Common Era, at the age of 32. But before he left Egypt, he founded a city. Or rather, he marked out the plan for a city and left others to build it. The city was built on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, west of the Delta, where a small Egyptian settlement called Rakotis already existed. The city was called Alexandria. Alexandria would become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty that succeeded Alexander's immediate successors in Egypt, it grew into a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, the largest city in the Mediterranean world, and arguably the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Its library, the famous Library of Alexandria, was the largest collection of written knowledge in the ancient world, housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Its museum, the Mosion, was a research institution that attracted scholars from throughout the Greek-speaking world. The mathematician Euclid worked there. The astronomer Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, worked there. The physician Herophilos, who conducted pioneering dissections of the human body, worked there. For several centuries, Alexandria was where the intellectual life of the Mediterranean world was centered. The Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt from 323 to 30, before the Common Era, was founded by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's generals. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks, and they ruled over a society that was a complex mixture of Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and other populations. The administrative and court language of Ptolemaic Egypt was Greek, but the Ptolemies were careful to present themselves as pharaohs in the Egyptian tradition. They built temples, they made offerings to the Egyptian gods, they were depicted in Egyptian royal regalia. The great temples at Edfu, Dendara, Philae, and Kom Ombo, whose remarkably well-preserved reliefs cover every available surface, with images of the Ptolemaic pharaohs interacting with the Egyptian gods, were built during the Ptolemaic period. They look to a non-specialist like ancient Egyptian temples. They are, technically speaking, Hellenistic buildings built in the Egyptian style. The fusion of Greek and Egyptian culture during the Ptolemaic period produced some remarkable hybrids. The god Serapis, invented more or less from scratch by Ptolemy I, combined aspects of the Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis with Greek religious concepts, and was worshipped throughout the Ptolemaic and later Roman empires. Egyptian magical practices were adopted and adapted by Greek practitioners, producing a body of magical texts known as the Greek magical papyri that blend Egyptian religious knowledge with Greek philosophical concepts in sometimes startling combinations. Isis, the great Egyptian goddess of motherhood and magic, became one of the most widely worshipped deities in the Roman world, her cult spreading from Egypt throughout the Mediterranean. The Egyptian response to Greek rule was not uniformly enthusiastic. There were native revolts against Ptolemaic authority, particularly in Upper Egypt, and the tension between the Greek-speaking ruling class and the Egyptian-speaking population was a persistent feature of Ptolemaic society. Egyptian priests maintained their own traditions and their own power within the religious institutions, and the relationship between the Greek crown and the Egyptian temple complexes was carefully managed on both sides. Towards the end of the Ptolemaic period, the dynasty was increasingly caught up in the politics of the Roman world, which was expanding its power throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt's wealth made it an object of intense Roman interest. The civil wars of the late Roman Republic pulled Egypt into the vortex of Roman politics, and the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt, navigated these deadly waters with remarkable skill before finally succumbing. Her name was Cleopatra. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh. No figure from the ancient world has been more romanticized, more distorted, more reduced to a single stereotype, and more persistently misunderstood than Cleopatra VII, who ruled Egypt from 51 to 30 before the Common Era. She has been imagined primarily as a seductress, a woman whose power rested entirely on her ability to attract powerful Roman men. Elizabeth Taylor played her in a purple wig. Hollywood has been very confident about the purple wig. The ancient sources are considerably less certain about it, and considerably more impressed by other aspects of her character. Here is what we actually know. Cleopatra was the first Ptolemaic ruler in nearly 300 years to learn the Egyptian language. She also learned Ethiopian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Parthian, Median, and several other languages, according to the ancient historian Plutarch, for a total of 9 languages in which she could conduct business without an interpreter. She was the head of state of the wealthiest kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean world. She managed the complex administrative machinery of Ptolemaic Egypt with skill and determination. She maintained Egypt's independence against the most powerful empire in the ancient world for 20 years. And she chose her political allies with considerable strategic sophistication. She was also, by contemporary accounts, personally magnetic and intellectually brilliant. Plutarch, writing more than a century after her death, noted that her beauty was not in itself absolutely incomparable, but that the attraction of her person combined with the charm of her conversation and the character she displayed in everything she said was something bewitching. This suggests that her power came less from her appearance than from her mind, her personality, and her presence, which is a rather different picture from the Hollywood version. Cleopatra came to power in 51 before the Common Era at the age of about 18, as co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, following the death of their father Ptolemy XII. The Ptolemaic tradition of sibling marriage meant that she was also technically married to her brother, which was both politically conventional and personally uncomfortable, as Ptolemy XIII and his advisors eventually moved against her and forced her into exile in 49 before the Common Era. Into this family dispute arrived Julius Caesar, the most powerful Roman general of his age, pursuing his defeated rival Pompey to Egypt in 48 before the Common Era. Pompey was murdered by Ptolemy XIII's advisors before Caesar arrived. Caesar was in Egypt, and Cleopatra needed Caesar's support. The story that she had herself smuggled into the palace in a rolled carpet or a linen sack to present herself to Caesar is probably apocryphal. The point is that she made contact with Caesar, formed an alliance with him, and through that alliance regained her throne. Caesar defeated Ptolemy XIII, who drowned in the Nile during the subsequent conflict. Cleopatra became queen in her own right, with a younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as nominal co-ruler. The relationship between Cleopatra and Caesar was both personal and political. A son, Caesarion, was born, whom Cleopatra claimed was Caesar's. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 before the Common Era, Cleopatra was in Rome with their son. She returned to Egypt and ruled independently for the next few years. She had Ptolemy XIV killed, making Caesarion her co-ruler instead. After Caesar's death, the Roman world was divided between Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir Octavian and Caesar's general and ally, Mark Antony. Antony took control of the eastern half of the empire and Egypt fell within his sphere. In 41 before the Common Era, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus, in what is now Turkey. She arrived. The ancient sources describe the arrival in terms that suggest she made an impression. Plutarch describes her being rowed up the river on a golden barge with silver oars, purple sails, and herself dressed as Aphrodite, fanned by boys dressed as Cupids. Whether this is precisely accurate or somewhat embellished by later tradition is unclear, but the scale of theatrical self-presentation it describes is entirely consistent with the Ptolemaic tradition of religious and political spectacle. Cleopatra and Antony formed both a personal relationship and a political alliance. They had 3 children together. Antony gave or promised various eastern territories to Cleopatra and her children in a ceremony in Alexandria known as the Donations of Alexandria, which his Roman enemies seized upon as evidence that he was surrendering Roman territory to a foreign queen. Octavian, in Rome, used this and other grievances against Antony to build the case for war. The conflict between Octavian and Antony was not simply a personal rivalry, it was a struggle for control of the Roman world. But Egypt's involvement made it also a conflict about the relationship between Rome and the last great independent Hellenistic kingdom. The war came to a decisive engagement at the Battle of Actium in 31 before the Common Era, a naval battle off the coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet was defeated by Octavian's Admiral Agrippa. The defeat was not immediately catastrophic, but it was strategically fatal. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt. Octavian pursued. In 30 before the Common Era, Octavian's forces entered Egypt. Antony, receiving false reports that Cleopatra was already dead, took his own life. Cleopatra survived him by a few days, long enough to meet with Octavian, assess her situation, and conclude that being paraded through Rome in his triumph was worse than death. She died on the 12th of August, 30 before the Common Era, probably from the bite of a cobra, or possibly from a poison she had prepared. She was 39 years old. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended and Egypt became a Roman province. 332 years of Ptolemaic rule, stretching back to the general who had carved out his kingdom after Alexander's death, came to an end with a woman sitting in a chair in the palace of Alexandria, deciding that death was preferable to humiliation. She was the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt in any meaningful sense. After her, Egypt had governors, not kings, administrators, not pharaohs. The 3,000-year tradition of the pharaonate, which had survived conquest by Libyans, Cushites, Persians, and Greeks, did not survive Rome. Or did it? We will come back to that question. Roman Egypt, the civilization under new masters. When Octavian, who shortly afterward took the honorific title Augustus and became the first Roman emperor, incorporated Egypt into the Roman Empire in 30 before the Common Era, he did something unusual. He did not make it a normal Roman province governed by a senator. He made it his personal possession, administered by a prefect drawn from the equestrian class rather than the senatorial class, and forbade Roman senators from entering Egypt without his personal permission. The reason for this special treatment was simple. Egypt was too wealthy and too strategically important to be allowed to become the power base of a potential rival. Control of Egypt meant control of the grain supply that fed Rome's enormous population. That was not something Augustus was prepared to share. Roman Egypt was thus a land of paradoxes. It was part of the Roman Empire and yet distinctly separate from it. Its population was Greek-speaking in the cities, Egyptian-speaking in the countryside, with a Jewish minority concentrated mainly in Alexandria. Its administration was Roman but operated through systems that were largely inherited from the Ptolemaic period, which had themselves been inherited from earlier Egyptian administrative traditions. The great temples continued to function. The priesthoods continued their rituals. The agricultural system based on the Nile flood continued to feed not only Egypt, but a significant portion of the Roman world. The Roman emperors, following the precedent set by the Ptolemaic rulers and before them by the Persian kings, presented themselves as pharaohs in the Egyptian context. The reliefs in the temples at Dendera, Philae, and elsewhere that show emperors in pharaonic regalia making offerings to the Egyptian gods were created under Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, Hadrian, and other Roman emperors who never came to Egypt, and would probably have been baffled by the images. But the tradition was maintained because the Egyptian priest knew what they needed from the Roman ruler, and the Roman administration was pragmatic enough to provide it. Alexandria under Roman rule remained one of the great cities of the ancient world. Its population, perhaps the largest in the empire after Rome itself, was famously turbulent. The city had a history of communal violence between its Greek, Jewish, and Egyptian populations that continued under Roman rule. The Great Pogrom against Alexandria's Jewish community during the reign of Caligula, described in searing detail by the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who witnessed it, is one of the earliest and most fully documented instances of organized communal violence in the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, or what remained of it after Julius Caesar's accidental fire in 48 before the Common Era had damaged parts of it, continued to function as a scholarly institution under Roman patronage. Outside the cities, rural Egypt continued in patterns that were ancient before the Romans arrived. Farmers worked the black earth left by the Nile flood. Villages organized their lives around the agricultural calendar. Local temples served as the religious and administrative centers of their communities. The annual Nile flood, which the entire Egyptian economic system depended on, continued its ancient rhythm of rise and fall. When the flood was good, Egypt prospered. When it failed, Egypt suffered. The Roman administration was, in some ways, better organized than its Ptolemaic predecessor at managing this dependence, maintaining irrigation systems and organizing the grain trade that sent hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat to Rome each year. The religious life of Roman Egypt was extraordinarily rich and diverse. Traditional Egyptian religion continued in the temples and in popular practice. The cult of Isis spread throughout the Roman world from its Egyptian base, becoming one of the most widely practiced mystery religions in the empire. The cult of Serapis, created in the Ptolemaic period, remained popular. The Jewish community maintained its own religious life and its own scriptures, and a new religion was spreading through the Eastern Mediterranean, one that would eventually transform the entire ancient world. Christianity came to Egypt early. The tradition, preserved in the Coptic Christian church that exists to this day, holds that the evangelist Mark brought Christianity to Alexandria in the 1st century of the Common Era. Whether this is historically accurate is difficult to verify, but there is no doubt that Christianity was established in Egypt very early in its history, and that Alexandria became one of the great centers of early Christian theology. The theologians Origen and Clement of Alexandria, writing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, were among the most important thinkers of early Christianity. The Coptic Church developed its own liturgical language, derived from ancient Egyptian and still used in religious services today, and its own distinctive traditions. In a very real sense, the Coptic Christian Church is the direct descendant of ancient Egyptian religious culture, transformed by contact with a new faith, but maintaining an unbroken institutional continuity. The 3rd century was a difficult time for the entire Roman Empire, not just for Egypt. Civil wars, economic crises, and military pressure on multiple frontiers stretched the imperial system nearly to breaking point. Egypt was caught up in these upheavals. In the 270 years, the city of Palmyra in Syria, under its remarkable ruler Zenobia, expanded its control to include Egypt briefly, before being reconquered by the Emperor Aurelian. Alexandria was sacked, partly destroyed, and rebuilt. The disruptions damaged both the physical fabric of the city and the economic and intellectual infrastructure it had maintained. The conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity under Constantine in the early 4th century had profound consequences for Egypt. Paganism, by which I mean the traditional polytheistic religions that had been practiced throughout the Roman world and that included the ancient Egyptian religious system, came under increasing pressure. Temples were closed, their property confiscated, their rites forbidden. The great temples of Egypt, which had functioned continuously for thousands of years and which had been centers of learning, craft production, and community life as well as religion, fell silent one by one. The last dated hieroglyphic inscription, found at Philae, dates to 394 of the Common Era. The last dated Demotic inscription, the final form of the Egyptian script descended from the hieroglyphs, dates to 452 of the Common Era. After that, the system that had been used to write the Egyptian language in one form or another for over 3,000 years went silent. Knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was lost. The great temple complex at Philae, on an island in the Nile near Aswan, was one of the last places in the Roman world where the old Egyptian religion was officially practiced. The priests there maintained their rituals into the late 5th century, when the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian finally closed the last temple and converted it to a Christian church. The conversion was, in a sense, the formal end of the ancient Egyptian religious tradition. But as we will see in the final chapter, endings are rarely as complete as they appear. The legacy of ancient Egypt, a civilization that refused to die, and so we have arrived at the end, or what looks like the end. In 30 before the Common Era, Egypt became a Roman province. The pharaohate ended. In the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, the temples closed, the priests died, the knowledge of hieroglyphs was lost. The Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 of the Common Era replaced Greek with Arabic as the language of administration, and eventually transformed Egypt's religious identity from Christian to Muslim. By any conventional measure, ancient Egyptian civilization was gone by the time the medieval period began. But the story is more complicated than that, more interesting than that, and ultimately more hopeful than that, because the civilization of ancient Egypt, as we have seen throughout this long journey, was never simply a collection of institutions or a political arrangement. It was a way of understanding the world, expressed in images and stories and rituals and buildings that proved remarkably resistant to destruction. The Coptic language, derived directly from ancient Egyptian and still used in the services of the Coptic Christian Church, carries within it the sounds and structures of the language spoken by the priests of Amun and the builders of the pyramids. Modern Egyptologists use Coptic as one of their tools for understanding ancient Egyptian because the connection between the two is direct and unbroken. The language did not die, it transformed. The Coptic Christian Church itself represents another form of continuity. Its liturgical traditions, its monastic practices, its sacred calendar, all show the influence of the ancient Egyptian religious culture from which it emerged. The cult of Isis was one of the most widespread in the late Roman world. As Christianity spread and Isis worship declined, many of the attributes of Isis, mother goddess, protector, healer, her iconography of a seated woman holding or nursing her divine son, transferred to the emerging Christian iconography of the Virgin Mary. This transfer was not deliberate or documented. It happened gradually through the shared visual culture of the Eastern Mediterranean, as one set of sacred images absorbed into another. But you can see it happening if you look at the images side by side. The ancient Egyptian tradition was folded into the new faith and survived within it. The physical monuments of ancient Egypt proved equally indestructible, not always because they were protected, but sometimes because they were simply too large and too solid to be gotten rid of. The pyramids of Giza were used as quarries in the medieval period. Their outer casing stones were stripped to build the medieval city of Cairo, yet the pyramids themselves remained too enormous to destroy. The great temples of Luxor and Karnak served as quarries, as houses, as churches, as mosques, as stables, and eventually as tourist sites, accumulating the traces of 2,000 years of subsequent use without losing their fundamental identity. The Valley of the Kings was robbed, systematically, but the tombs and their paintings survived. The desert, which had always been Egypt's greatest preserver, protected what generations of human activity might have destroyed. When European scholars began to turn serious attention to ancient Egypt in the 17th and 18th centuries, they found a landscape littered with monuments of extraordinary grandeur that nobody alive could read. The hieroglyphs on the temple walls were beautiful, obviously significant, clearly a form of writing, but utterly incomprehensible. For centuries, the conventional assumption was that hieroglyphs were symbolic rather than phonetic, that they conveyed meaning through their images rather than through sounds. This assumption was wrong, and it made decipherment essentially impossible. The key to unlocking the hieroglyphs arrived by accident in the summer of 1799, when French soldiers under Napoleon's Egyptian expedition were excavating the foundations of a fort near the town of Rosetta in the Delta. They found a large piece of grand diorite inscribed with a text in 3 scripts: hieroglyphs at the top, Demotic in the middle, and Greek at the bottom. A bilingual inscription, later discovered to be trilingual since the hieroglyphs and Demotic, both render the same text as the Greek, which was a decree of the priests of Memphis honouring the pharaoh Ptolemy V, issued in 196 before the Common Era. The Rosetta Stone, as it became known, is one of the most important objects in the history of scholarship. With a known language, Greek, and the same text in 2 unknown scripts, scholars could now, in theory, work out the structure of the Egyptian writing system. In practice, it took 20 years and the efforts of multiple scholars, most importantly the English polymath Thomas Young and the French scholar Jean-François Champollion, to crack the code. Champollion's breakthrough came in 1822, when he realised that hieroglyphs were neither purely symbolic nor purely phonetic, but a complex mixed system using both phonograms, signs representing sounds, and ideograms, signs representing concepts or objects. With this insight, the hieroglyphs could be read. The ancient Egyptians could speak again. The discovery of how to read hieroglyphs is one of the great intellectual achievements of the modern era. It opened 3,000 years of Egyptian texts to scholars and eventually to the public. It transformed our understanding of the ancient world, revealing a civilization far richer, more complex, and more human than the monuments alone had suggested. The texts recovered from tombs and temples and papyri collections told us what the Egyptians thought about the gods, what they felt about death, how they organized their government, what they ate and drank and wore, what they feared, what they hoped for, and what they thought was funny. They did, incidentally, think things were funny. Egyptian humour was bone-dry and somewhat sarcastic, which I find personally relatable. The modern study of Egyptology, which began in earnest with the decipherment of hieroglyphs in the early 19th century, has been one of the most productive areas of archaeological and historical scholarship. Every decade brings new discoveries, new analyses of existing materials, and new revisions to our understanding. The tombs and temples still yield new information. The desert still hides unexcavated sites. The Papyrian Museum collection still contain untranslated texts. Egypt continues to be discovered, and the process of discovery shows no sign of ending. The influence of ancient Egypt on subsequent civilizations is impossible to fully catalogue. It is present in the obelisks that stand in Paris, London, New York, and Rome, most of them removed from Egypt in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It is present in the pyramidal forms that appear in architecture, from the 18th century Masonic imagery of the United States dollar to the Louvre's glass pyramid entrance. It is present in the Western fascination with mummies, with curses, with hidden treasure, with the idea of a vast ancient knowledge waiting to be recovered. It is present, more directly, in the descendants of the ancient Egyptians who still live along the Nile, who still farm the black earth deposited by the annual flood, now controlled by the Aswan High Dam rather than by cosmic beneficence, but still the same black earth that fed the pyramid builders. The Nile itself remains, not quite the Nile that Herodotus described, since the Aswan High Dam has changed its hydrology permanently, eliminating the annual flood and with it the silt, deposits that created ancient Egypt's extraordinary fertility. In some ways, this is the most complete change that has happened to Egypt in its entire history. The flood that created Egypt, that was Egypt in a very fundamental sense. That was the basis of every calendar and every tax and every religious observance for thousands of years, no longer comes. The High Dam brought electricity and year-round irrigation and freedom from the destruction that floods could bring, and it ended an era that had begun 10,000 years before. And yet even this change has not erased what the Nile made. The language survives in the church. The religious images survived folded into later traditions. The monuments survive in the desert. The texts survive in museums and on computer databases, where they can be read and studied and understood. The wisdom literature of the Middle Kingdom, the love poetry of the New Kingdom, the practical manuals of agriculture and medicine, the great mythological narratives of Osiris and Isis and Horus, all of these are available to anyone who wants to read them. The dead speak, 3,000 years after their deaths, through the texts they carved in stone and wrote on papyrus and pressed into clay. Egypt refused to die because death was never really the end in Egyptian thinking. The resurrection of Osiris, the nightly death and daily rebirth of the sun, the annual death and rebirth of the agricultural cycle, All of these were part of a cosmology in which death was not an ending but a transformation. Things changed form. They did not cease to be. The pharaoh died and became Osiris. The sun sank into the underworld and emerged reborn. The flood receded and the black earth it left behind burst into green life. If you were an ancient Egyptian, you understood the world as a place of continuous renewal, where nothing was ever truly lost, only transformed. Whether or not you share that theology, the history of Egyptian civilization gives it a certain poetic validity, a civilization that began around 3100 before the Common Era, that maintained its essential identity through conquest after conquest, through collapse and revival, through Hyksos and Libyans and Cushites and Persians and Macedonians and Romans, that survived long enough to fold its traditions into Christianity and Islam and into the modern world's imagination, that is still being discovered and studied and understood 3,000 years after it ceased to be a living political entity. Such a civilization cannot be said to have died. It changed form, and in changing form it endured. The pyramids still stand. The Sphinx still gazes eastward. The Nile still flows, though tamed now by concrete rather than caressed by the gentle silt of the Ethiopian highlands. The golden mask of Tutankhamun still gleams in the Cairo Museum, still protecting the face of a boy king who ruled for 9 years and has been famous for 3,300. The temples at Karnak and Luxor are still visited by millions of people each year, people who stand in the hyperstyle hall and look up at those enormous columns and feel something they might not be able to name exactly, a sense of scale, of time, of human ambition and human achievement, of the enduring capacity of people to build things that outlast them by millennia. That feeling is Egypt's legacy, not just the specific knowledge of which pharaoh built which pyramid or which god was worshipped at which temple. Those things matter, and we have spent this long evening exploring them. But the deeper legacy is the feeling that standing before those monuments, reading those texts, tracing those images produces in us. The feeling that human beings have always reached toward something larger than themselves, toward permanence, toward beauty, toward meaning, toward a world in which death is not the end and the work of our hands will outlast us. The Egyptians called the proper order of things Ma'at, the right relationship between all things. When Ma'at was maintained, the sun rose, the river flooded, the crops grew, and the dead found peace. When Ma'at was disturbed, everything went wrong. They spent 3,000 years trying to maintain it, building temples, conducting rituals, writing texts, carving images in stone, making the best jewellery the ancient world had ever seen, composing love poetry, arguing with their neighbours about who had stolen the goat, building the most remarkable buildings in human history. They did not always succeed. No civilization does. But the attempt was genuine, sustained, and magnificent. And the monuments they left behind, both physical and intellectual, bear witness to that attempt more eloquently than any summary can. So as the lights dim tonight and the river flows quietly in the dark and the desert stars appear above the plateau where the pyramids stand, let the story settle into silence. 3,000 years of kings and farmers and scribes and priests and soldiers and artists, all of them living by the river, all of them watching the sky, all of them doing their best to keep the world in order. Let their voices join the quiet hum of the night. Let their monuments loom in the imagination, white and enormous under a desert sun. Let the river flow. Let the story rest. Egypt is not gone. It changed form, and in that transformation, as in all things, the civilization that refused to die proved one more time that it was right. Good night from almighty sleep. Tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these long evenings in history. Until next time, take care of yourselves. The river will still be there in the morning.